She'd buried husband after husband, each death followed by a new fortune. And down in the cellar, something unearthly kept whispering her name. When investigators finally forced her door open, they uncovered more than poison. They found evidence of a pact that never should have been made. Welcome to True Crime Headquarters, where the stories get darker and the truth cuts deeper. I'm glad you're here. If you enjoy these late-night truths, please like, comment, and subscribe. It helps the channel grow and keeps these stories alive. This is the story of the Demon's Bride, Alice Keitler and the witchcraft that poisoned medieval Ireland. We're tracking a killer tonight, but this predator didn't hunt alone. She had a partner, something that crept through the shadows of 14th century Ireland, something that demanded blood, obedience, and unspeakable rituals in exchange for wealth beyond measure. Alice Keitler wasn't just accused of murder. She was accused of opening a doorway that should have remained sealed forever. And when the church finally came for her, what they discovered in her mansion would become the blueprint for every witch trial that followed. This is the story of Ireland's first condemned witch, a woman so dangerous that 7 centuries later, her name still carries a curse. Kilkenny, Ireland, 1324. The stench of death clings to the Keitler mansion like a second skin. William Outlaw, Alice's 4th husband, lies writhing in his bed. His skin has turned the color of spoiled milk. His hair falls out in clumps when his servants try to comfort him. He vomits black bile that burns holes in the linens. The physicians shake their heads. They've never seen a sickness quite like this. But William's children from his first marriage have seen it before. They've watched 3 other men waste away in this same bed, in this same room, while Alice Keitler moved through the halls like a phantom, her face never showing grief, never showing concern, never showing anything except a strange, satisfied smile. William's son corners him during a moment of clarity. "Father," he whispers, "you must listen to me. You're being poisoned." The old man's eyes widen. Somewhere in the fog of his dying mind, pieces begin to connect. The strange powders Alice stirs into his wine. The way she watches him drink with those cold, calculating eyes. The locked room in the cellar that she forbids anyone to enter. The visitors who come in the dead of night. Hooded figures who speak in languages that sound like bones scraping against stone. But it's too late. William Outlaw dies 3 days later, his body so corrupted that even the priests hesitate before administering last rites. His tongue has turned black. His fingernails have fallen off. His eyes have sunk so deep into his skull that he looks like a corpse days before he actually becomes one. Alice doesn't weep at the funeral. She doesn't tear her clothes or throw herself on the coffin like a proper widow should. She stands silent as stone, dressed in black silk that probably cost more than most of Kilkenny's citizens earn in a lifetime. And when the last shovelful of dirt hits William's grave, she turns and walks away without looking back. The children of her dead husbands finally have enough. They go to Richard de Ladrede, the Bishop of Ossory, a man known for his zealous faith and his absolute conviction that Satan walks among humanity, constantly seeking souls to devour. They tell him everything. The mysterious deaths, the locked cellar, the strange visitors, the powders and potions, the way their father's fortunes always passed entirely to Alice, leaving the legitimate children with nothing. Bishop de Ladrede listens with growing horror. This isn't just murder, he realizes. This is something far worse. This is witchcraft, heresy, a corruption so profound that it threatens not just bodies but souls. He orders an investigation immediately. What his investigators uncover will shock medieval Ireland to its core. They start by interviewing Alice's servants. Most refuse to talk, their eyes darting nervously toward the Keitler mansion as if they expect something to emerge and strike them down for speaking. But a few, the ones Alice has wronged, the ones she's beaten or starved or threatened, finally break their silence. They speak of midnight ceremonies in the cellar. They describe Alice and her accomplices sweeping the streets of Kilkenny after dark, gathering the dirt and dust into special bags. They talk about horrible concoctions brewed in copper pots, mixtures containing the intestines of roosters, the brains of unbaptized infants, the nails and hair of corpses stolen from fresh graves, and herbs so poisonous that merely touching them causes the skin to blister. These potions, the servants whisper, were stirred with the femur bone of a thief who died on the gallows, while Alice chanted words in a language that made the listener's ears bleed. But the servants' most disturbing revelation concerns Alice's alleged demon lover. They call him Robin Artist's son. Some describe him as a handsome nobleman who visits Alice's bedchamber in the dead of night. Others see him differently, as something that wears a human shape like an ill-fitting coat, something with eyes that reflect light like an animal's, something that leaves behind a smell of sulfur and rotting meat. Alice, they claim, has given herself completely to this entity. In exchange for her soul and her obedience, Robin Artist's son grants her wealth, power, and the knowledge of how to kill without suspicion. The servants lead the investigators to Alice's private chamber. They show them the closet where she keeps her materials. When the investigators open it, they stagger backward, crossing themselves frantically. Inside, they find a communion wafer stolen from a church, stamped with the name of the demon, candles made from human fat, ointments in jars labeled with obscene names, a staff of oak wood, greased with the ointment and used in rituals too vile to record in the official documents, books written in cipher, containing spells and incantations, vials of powder identified as arsenic, hemlock, and nightshade, enough poison to kill 100 men. The final discovery awaits in the cellar. The investigators break down the locked door with axes. The room beyond is windowless, lit only by their flickering torches. The walls are covered in symbols. Not Christian symbols, but twisted, blasphemous versions of them. Crosses turned upside down, Latin phrases written backward, strange geometric patterns that seem to shift and writhe in the uncertain light. In the center of the room stands an altar, not an altar to God, but an altar to something else, something older, something hungrier. The stone is stained dark with what can only be blood. Around it lie the remnants of sacrifices, animal bones picked clean, feathers, scales, and other things the investigators refuse to identify in their reports. But the most damning evidence sits on a shelf above the altar. A leather-bound book. The investigators open it with trembling hands. Inside, written in Alice's own handwriting, is a catalog of her crimes. Dates of poisonings, lists of ingredients, records of payments made to her in exchange for curses placed on enemies, and scattered throughout, prayers to Robin Artist's son, pledging her devotion, begging for his continued favor, promising him sacrifices of increasing magnitude. One entry, dated just 3 weeks before William Outlaw's death, reads, "Tonight, I gave him the final dose. Robin promises this one will be the most profitable yet. My lord requires a celebration. I shall provide it." Bishop de Ladrede reads the evidence and makes his decision. Alice Keitler will be arrested, tried, and if found guilty, burned at the stake for heresy and witchcraft. She will become an example, a warning to anyone else who might consider trafficking with demons. The year is 1324, and Ireland is about to witness its first witchcraft trial, a template that will be copied and refined over the next 4 centuries, leading to the torture and execution of thousands. But Alice Keitler is not going down without a fight, and she has resources, both natural and supernatural, that the good bishop cannot possibly anticipate. The arrest order goes out on a cold morning in March. Bishop de Ladrede personally leads a contingent of armed men to the Keitler mansion, confident that he's doing God's work, certain that justice will be swift and righteous. Alice is waiting for him. She stands in her doorway, flanked by servants, dressed in her finest gown. She doesn't look like a frightened criminal about to be dragged to prison. She looks like a queen receiving unwelcome guests. When the bishop announces the charges, Alice doesn't flinch. She doesn't protest her innocence. Instead, she smiles, a cold, knowing smile that makes several of the soldiers take an involuntary step backward. "You dare accuse me?" Her voice carries across the courtyard, clear and strong. "I am Alice Keitler, daughter of one of the founding families of Kilkenny. My family built this town. We fund its churches. We employ half its citizens. And you, Bishop, are a foreigner, an Englishman who barely speaks our language and understands nothing of our ways. It's a calculated move, and it works. The watching crowd begins to murmur. Alice isn't just any accused witch. She's nobility. She's wealthy. She's connected. Arresting her isn't a simple matter of dragging some peasant woman to jail. It's a political nightmare. Bishop de Ladrede presses forward anyway. Your rank means nothing before God. The evidence against you is overwhelming. You will submit to the church's authority. Will I? Alice's smile widens. We'll see about that. She retreats into her mansion and bars the door. The bishop orders his men to break it down, but before they can act, riders arrive. Messengers from Arnold le Poer, the Chancellor of Ireland and one of the most powerful nobles in the country. Le Poer sends word that the bishop is overstepping his authority. Any arrest of Alice Keitler must go through proper secular channels first. The bishop must obtain permission from the civil courts. It's a delaying tactic, but it works. The bishop is forced to withdraw and begin navigating the labyrinth of medieval bureaucracy. Meanwhile, Alice isn't idle. She begins calling in every favor she's accumulated over her 4 marriages. Money flows from her coffers to strategic pockets. Influential men suddenly develop amnesia about the things they've witnessed. Documents disappear. Potential witnesses flee Kilkenny in the middle of the night. But Alice isn't just fighting a legal battle. According to later testimonies, she's also fighting a supernatural one. Her accomplices begin mobilizing. The investigation eventually identifies 11 people in Alice's inner circle, but the true number is certainly higher. These aren't random associates, they're a carefully constructed network of power. There's her son, William Outlaw Jr., who has learned everything his mother knows about poisons and demons. There's Petronella de Meath, Alice's personal maid and closest confidant, a woman who participated in every ritual and witnessed every murder. There's Basilia Sisek and others whose names appear in the records as fellow practitioners of the forbidden arts. Together, they form something unprecedented in medieval Ireland, an organized cult devoted to dark powers, led by a woman who has turned murder into a profitable business. The servants who spoke to the investigators begin dying under mysterious circumstances. One is found in his home, his body twisted into an impossible position, his face frozen in an expression of absolute terror. Another drowns in a rain barrel that contains barely 6 inches of water. A third goes mad overnight, screaming about shadows with too many eyes, and has to be locked in a monastery for his own safety. The message is clear. Betray Alice Keitler, and something will come for you. Bishop de Ladrede realizes he's not just fighting one woman. He's fighting an entire conspiracy that reaches into the highest levels of Irish society. He writes frantic letters to the Pope, begging for support, describing a threat that could corrupt all of Ireland if left unchecked. But the Pope's response, when it finally arrives months later, is cautious and non-committal. The Holy See doesn't want to start a war with Irish nobility over one woman, no matter how guilty she might be. The bishop decides to force the issue. If the civil courts won't help him, he'll use the one weapon he has that transcends secular authority: excommunication. He declares Alice and her accomplices excommunicated, cut off from the church, their souls condemned to hell. In medieval society, this is a death sentence of a different kind. An excommunicated person can't trade, can't testify in court, can't own property. They become legal non-entities, ghosts walking among the living. But Alice has one more card to play: Arnold le Poer himself. Le Poer's protection of Alice isn't just political calculation. According to the evidence that later emerges, he's one of her clients. Alice has sold him curses and poisons to use against his own enemies. He's benefited from her dark knowledge, and now she calls in the debt. Le Poer does something almost unthinkable. He has Bishop de Ladrede arrested. The charge? Defaming the Irish nobility. The bishop is thrown into Kilkenny Castle's dungeon and held for 17 days. It's a clear message to everyone watching. Alice Keitler is untouchable. The church itself cannot bring her down. But the bishop's imprisonment backfires spectacularly. The news spreads throughout Ireland and reaches England. The Pope finally takes notice. So does King Edward II. Letters fly back and forth between Dublin, Rome, and London. The pressure on Arnold Lupoer becomes unbearable. He's forced to release the bishop and withdraw his open protection of Alice. Alice sees the walls closing in. Her money and influence can delay justice, but they can't prevent it forever. The evidence is too strong, the accusations too public. Even her noble friends are beginning to quietly distance themselves. Nobody wants to be associated with Ireland's most notorious accused, which when the Pope himself is watching. So Alice makes her final move. She runs. One night, while the authorities are preparing a new arrest warrant that even Lupoer can't block, Alice Keitler vanishes from Kilkenny. She takes her portable wealth, gold, jewels, documents, and disappears into the darkness. Some say she fled to England. Others claim she went to Scotland or even further abroad. The truth is never discovered. Alice Keitler simply ceases to exist in the historical record after 1324. But before she flees, according to the testimony of her maid Petronella, Alice performs one final ritual. She calls upon Robin Artisan one last time, offering him a sacrifice of gratitude for the years of protection and prosperity. What she sacrifices, Petronella later screams during her own interrogation, is too horrible to speak aloud. But it involves blood and darkness, and promises that will echo through her family line for generations. Alice escapes. She lives free somewhere beyond Ireland's reach. But she leaves behind her accomplices, her servants, and her secrets. And Bishop de Ladrede, denied the satisfaction of burning the witch herself, decides that someone must pay for Alice's crimes. If he cannot have the Queen of the Coven, he will settle for her pawns. The hunt now turns to those who stayed behind, those who trusted in Alice's protection but were not valuable enough to take with her. Their ordeal is about to begin, and it will be far worse than anything Alice herself would have faced, because the bishop has learned from his failure to catch Alice. This time, he will make sure no one escapes justice, temporal or eternal. Petronella de Meath knows she's going to die. She's known it since the morning they dragged her from Alice's mansion in chains, since the moment she realized her mistress had abandoned her to save herself. But knowing death is coming and experiencing its approach are two different torments. The cell stinks of old blood and despair. The stones are covered in scratches, fingernail marks left by previous occupants who tried to claw their way to freedom or simply to madness, anything to escape the horror of what was happening to them. Petronella has been here for 3 days, and already she can feel her sanity beginning to fray. She hears whispers in the darkness. She sees shapes moving in the corners where no shapes should be. Sometimes she thinks she hears Robin Artisan's voice, mocking her, reminding her of the rituals she performed, the oaths she swore, the damnation she earned. Bishop de Ladrede comes to visit her personally. He's not cruel for cruelty's sake. He genuinely believes he's saving her soul. If he can break her body enough to free her from demonic influence, if he can extract a confession and achieve repentance, perhaps her soul can still escape eternal hellfire. Some mercy, he tells her. She should be grateful. The torture begins that afternoon. They use the strappato first, a simple, efficient technique. They tie Petronella's wrists behind her back, attach the rope to a pulley, and haul her into the air. The weight of her body pulls her shoulders from their sockets with a wet, popping sound that makes even the guards wince. She screams, but the bishop calmly explains that screaming won't help. Demons are stubborn. Pain is the only language they understand. Tell us about Alice's crimes, he says. Confirm what we already know. Give us details. Petronella tries to resist. She truly does. But after the 3rd time they drop her, letting her fall until the rope goes taut and her arms nearly tear free of her torso, the words start pouring out. She tells them everything. The midnight rituals, the stolen communion wafers used in obscene parodies of the Massachusetts, the ointments they made from corpse fat and poisonous herbs. the incantations they chanted while Alice sacrificed animals on that basement altar. But the bishop wants more. He wants to hear about Robin Artisan. Describe him, de Ladrede demands. Describe the demon that Alice served. Through tears and blood, Petronella speaks. She tells them that Robin appeared to Alice in different forms. Sometimes he came as a handsome knight, dressed in black, speaking in a voice that sounded like silk over steel. Other times, his true nature would show through, the glamour would slip, and they would see something else underneath. Something with too many joints in its limbs. Something with eyes that reflected red in the candlelight. Something that smelled of grave dirt and sulfur and ancient, patient hunger. Alice loved him, Petronella whispers. Not the way a woman loves a man, the way a slave loves a master, the way the damned love their chains. He promised her wealth and power, and she gave him everything in return. Her body, her soul, her humanity. She would do anything he asked. Anything. What did he ask for? The bishop leans forward, his eyes burning with zealous intensity. Petronella hesitates. Some secrets are too terrible to speak, even in a torture chamber. But they apply the strappado again, and this time they add weights to her feet. The agony is indescribable. She breaks completely. Blood, she gasps. He wanted blood. Animal blood at first. Then other blood. Blood from the innocent. Blood from children. The room goes silent. The guards cross themselves. The bishop's face turns white. Alice sacrificed children? His voice shakes despite his attempt to control it. She obtained infants who died unbaptized. Their bodies, their parts, for the rituals, for the potions. Robin told her that innocent blood was the most powerful ingredient. And she obeyed. The confession spreads through Kilkenny like wildfire. Whatever sympathy remained for Alice evaporates instantly. Poisoning husbands is comprehensible, even if monstrous. Plenty of women throughout history have killed inconvenient spouses. But child sacrifice? That puts Alice Keitler into a different category entirely. She's no longer just a criminal. She's a monster, an abomination, a creature wearing human skin. Bishop de Ladrede has his confession, but he's not satisfied. He wants Petronella to make a public recantation, to acknowledge her sins before all of Kilkenny, to warn others away from the path she chose. He promises her mercy if she complies, a quick death instead of slow burning. She agrees. What choice does she have? They stage the event in the town square on a gray November morning. Thousands gather to watch. Petronella is dragged to a platform, barely able to stand, her body broken by weeks of torture. She can hardly speak, but the bishop's clerks have prepared a statement for her to read. She repeats the words mechanically, confirming every detail of Alice's crimes, describing the rituals, the poisons, the demon worship. The crowd listens in horrified silence. Some people weep. Others shout curses at Petronella, calling her a monster, demanding her death. She doesn't react to any of it. She's beyond caring. All she wants now is for it to end. The bishop grants her the mercy he promised. Petronella de Meath is tied to a stake and strangled before the fire is lit. She dies quickly, without suffering the agonizing death by burning that she feared. It's a small kindness, but in medieval Ireland, any kindness shown to a convicted witch is notable. Then they light the fire anyway, burning her corpse to ash. The bishop explains that this is necessary. It's not just about punishing the criminal, it's about destroying any lingering demonic corruption. Petronella's body, tainted by years of contact with dark forces, must be completely annihilated. Only then can the community be truly safe. The other accomplices meet worse fates. Some are wealthy enough to buy their way out with massive fines that beggar their families for generations. Others are publicly whipped through the streets of Kilkenny, stripped naked and beaten bloody, while priests chant prayers of exorcism. A few disappear into monastic prisons, locked away in tiny cells where they will spend the rest of their lives on their knees, praying for forgiveness they will never truly receive. William Outlaw Jr., Alice's own son, her heir and closest student, receives special attention. As Alice's direct blood relative, the bishop believes he's likely to be the most corrupted. William is forced to hear Mass 3 times daily for an entire year. He must personally fund repairs to the cathedral roof. He must walk barefoot through Kilkenny, carrying a candle and publicly repenting his sins. The humiliation is calculated to break his spirit and his pride. But William endures it all. Unlike his mother, he doesn't run. He accepts his punishment, pays his fines, and slowly, carefully, begins rebuilding his reputation. Years later, he will become a respected citizen of Kilkenny again, though whispers about his mother will follow his family for generations. Every misfortune that befalls the outlaw line will be attributed to Alice's curse, to the stain she left on her bloodline, to Robin Artisan's lingering influence. Bishop de Ladrede orders Alice's mansion searched one final time. The workers who break into the sealed basement chamber report feeling overwhelming dread, as if something invisible is watching them from the shadows. They find more evidence: journals, letters, and a series of disturbing paintings on the walls depicting rituals that make even hardened soldiers cross themselves and whisper prayers. Everything is burned. The mansion itself is partially demolished, its stones scattered. The bishop wants no shrine to evil, no place where future devil worshippers might gather to honor Alice's memory. The site remains cursed in local memory for centuries. Even today, residents of Kilkenny tell stories about the haunted ruins, about shadows that move when no one is watching, about whispers in a language that predates Christianity. But one question haunts everyone involved: where is Alice herself? Alice Keitler disappears into legend and becomes something more dangerous than any single criminal. She becomes a template, a blueprint, a warning that spreads across Europe like plague. The most credible accounts suggest she fled to England, using her remaining wealth and connections to buy protection among English nobility who cared nothing about Irish church politics. Some records hint at a woman matching her description living comfortably in London under an assumed name, maintaining a household, even remarrying one final time. If these accounts are true, Alice lived out her days in luxury and died peacefully in her bed, never facing justice for the men she murdered and the souls she corrupted. Other stories are darker and more fantastical. Irish folklore claims she didn't flee at all. She simply vanished, taken by Robin Artisan to some realm beyond human reach. Late-night travelers near Kilkenny report seeing a woman in medieval dress walking the old roads, her face hidden in shadow, her presence bringing a chill that has nothing to do with weather. She appears at crossroads and near graveyards, some say, still collecting ingredients for her potions, still serving her demonic master centuries after her death. The most disturbing accounts come from subsequent witch trials across Europe. In Scotland, Germany, France, and Spain, accused witches confessed to meeting a coven leader named Alice, a woman who taught them the arts of poison and demon summoning. Some describe her as impossibly old, her face lined with centuries but her eyes still sharp and calculating. Others claim she appears young, beautiful, and ageless, preserved by Robin Artisan's power, wandering from country to country, creating new covens, spreading her corruption like a virus. These accounts are almost certainly fiction, confessions extracted under torture or invented by inquisitors to connect their local cases to famous precedents. But they speak to Alice's enduring impact. She becomes the archetype of the evil witch, wealthy, intelligent, sexually deviant, murderously ambitious, and utterly without remorse. Every subsequent witch trial references her, either directly or indirectly. The evidence discovered in her basement becomes the standard template for what inquisitors expect to find. The details of her demon lover become the model for all future descriptions of Satan's earthly consorts. Bishop de Ladrede writes extensively about the case, creating a manual that will guide witch hunters for centuries. He describes the warning signs of witchcraft: unexplained wealth in women, multiple dead husbands, knowledge of herbs and medicines, sexual independence, intelligence that seems unnatural for a female. He explains interrogation techniques, torture methods calibrated to break a witch's will without killing her before she can confess. He emphasizes the importance of public executions, making examples of the condemned to terrify others away from similar sins. His work influences the Malleus Maleficarum, the infamous Hammer of Witches, published in 1487. That book, which becomes the standard inquisitor's guidebook, echoes many of de Ladride's observations about Alice Keiteler. The link is direct and traceable. Alice's case helps create the intellectual framework for the witch hunts that will kill tens of thousands across Europe over the next 3 centuries. The irony is crushing. Alice herself escapes. She lives free. But her case creates a machinery of persecution that grinds innocent women into dust for generations. Every elderly herbalist burned at the stake, every midwife tortured for knowing too much about childbirth, every independent woman accused by jealous neighbors. They all die, in part, because of precedents set during Alice Keiteler's prosecution. Modern historians debate what really happened in 14th century Kilkenny. Some argue Alice was innocent, or at least not guilty of supernatural crimes. Merely a clever woman who knew how to use poison and got unlucky enough to be caught. They point out that Bishop de Ladride had political motivations for prosecuting her, that he was an outsider trying to establish authority by attacking a powerful local family. The demon worship could have been propaganda, exaggerations built from rumors and torture-induced confessions. Others aren't so sure. The evidence, even stripped of supernatural interpretation, is damning. For husbands dead under suspicious circumstances, massive quantities of poison found in Alice's possession, testimony from multiple witnesses about secret ceremonies and strange visitors, the locked basement chamber with its disturbing contents. Even if Robin Artisan was a fiction, perhaps a human lover whom Alice passed off as supernatural to frighten her followers into obedience, the murders were real. The manipulation was real. The cruelty was real. Perhaps the truth is that Alice Keiteler was both. A mundane killer who used supernatural window dressing to enhance her power and mystique, and a genuine believer in dark forces who thought she could bargain with demons for worldly gain. Medieval people lived in a world where the spiritual and material realms overlapped constantly. To them, poisoning someone and cursing someone weren't different categories of crime. They were 2 aspects of the same evil art. What we know for certain is that Alice Keiteler got away with murder. Multiple murders. She exploited her wealth, her connections, and her intelligence to kill with impunity for years. When finally caught, she used those same advantages to escape punishment entirely. She is one of history's most successful serial killers, a woman who turned murder into profit and then vanished before justice could touch her. The Keiteler Inn still stands in Kilkenny today, built on the site of Alice's original mansion. It's now a popular tourist attraction, a medieval building turned restaurant where visitors can eat dinner in the same halls where Alice once entertained her husbands and plotted their deaths. The basement, that infamous basement where she allegedly conducted her rituals, is now a wine cellar. Tour guides tell sanitized versions of the story, turning horror into entertainment. But locals know better than to linger there after dark. Staff members report strange occurrences. Bottles falling from shelves with no explanation, cold spots that appear in summer, shadows that move wrong, and occasionally, a woman's laughter echoing from empty rooms. Overnight cleaners refuse to work alone. Some have quit after experiencing what they describe as overwhelming dread in certain areas of the building, particularly near the old basement stairs. Psychics and paranormal investigators flock to the location. They claim to sense multiple presences, not just Alice, but also her victims, trapped somehow by the violence that ended their lives. One investigator reported seeing a man in medieval clothing standing beside the bar, his face gray and twisted, his eyes pleading. When she approached, he vanished. She later saw a portrait of William Outlaw, Alice's first husband, and recognized him immediately. Whether these experiences are genuine hauntings, psychological phenomena, or simply the power of suggestion working on minds primed by the location's grim history, they keep Alice Keiteler's story alive. She remains present in Kilkenny's collective consciousness, a cautionary tale about unchecked ambition, the dangers of occult dabbling, and the way evil can wear a beautiful face. Her ultimate fate remains one of history's unsolved mysteries. Did she die peacefully in England, an old woman surrounded by servants and luxury, her crimes forgotten or forgiven by distance? Did Robin Artisan claim his final payment, dragging her soul to whatever hell awaits those who make bargains with demons? Or does she still wander somehow, sustained by dark powers, watching as centuries pass and her legend grows? The question haunts us because it touches something fundamental about justice and the universe. We want to believe that people like Alice Keitler eventually face consequences. We want cosmic balance, karmic retribution, some guarantee that evil ultimately loses. But Alice's story suggests otherwise. Sometimes the guilty escape. Sometimes the wicked prosper. Sometimes monsters wear human faces, smile at us across the dinner table, and then vanish into the night before we realize what they truly were. That's the real horror of Alice Keitler. Not the alleged demon worship, not the theatrical rituals, not even the brutal murders. It's the fact that she won. She killed without meaningful consequences, lived without punishment, and died, if she died at all, on her own terms. She beat the system, beat the church, beat justice itself. And somewhere in the shadows of history, she might be laughing still. The tale of Alice Keitler doesn't offer closure. It doesn't provide the comfort of seeing evil punished. Instead, it serves as a reminder that the world doesn't always work the way we want it to. Monsters exist. Some of them are caught, but others slip through our fingers like smoke, leaving behind only bodies, mysteries, and the disturbing question: how many more are out there right now, smiling and charming and killing, confident that they too will never face judgment? That question follows us into the darkness long after the story ends. If you're new here, welcome to the channel, where we dive into true crime stories with calmness and respect. A special shout out to my amazing subscribers who've been with me from the start. Thank you for your incredible support. If you're still with me, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. Or just say hello so I know you're still here. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and hit subscribe so you won't miss any of our upcoming true crime stories perfect for winding down. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2, The Architect of Annihilation. When silence becomes a weapon, no one hears you disappear. Some men don't just take lives, they erase entire futures, one calculated breath at a time. Tonight, we descend into the cold mathematics of murder, where a man weaponized trust itself, turning ordinary moments into death traps. Andrei Evseev didn't explode with rage or lose control. He planned, he waited, he executed with the precision of someone who understood that the most dangerous predators are the ones who smile while they sharpen their knives. This is the story of a killer who walked among us wearing the mask of normalcy, and by the time anyone realized what lurked beneath that surface, the body count had already begun. What you're about to hear isn't just about death. It's about the terrifying reality that sometimes evil doesn't announce itself with thunder. It whispers in the shadows, patient and meticulous, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Andrei Evseev understood something fundamental about human nature that most people never grasp. We are hardwired to trust the familiar, to believe in the safety of routine, to assume that danger wears a recognizable face. He exploited this evolutionary blind spot with surgical precision, crafting a persona so unremarkable, so thoroughly ordinary, that he became invisible even while standing in plain sight. This wasn't the chaotic violence of a man possessed by demons. This was something far more chilling. This was control, pure and absolute. The city of Kampadamar, Shankaria knew Andrei as a neighbor, a colleague, someone who existed on the periphery of daily life without drawing attention or suspicion. He possessed that rare quality of human camouflage, the ability to blend so seamlessly into the background that people's eyes would slide past him without registering his presence. He never spoke too loudly, never demanded attention, never exhibited the red flags that populate our cultural understanding of danger. No explosive temper, no history of violence that neighbors could later recall with hand-wringing clarity. No warning signs that would later make people say, "We should have known." That absence of obvious threat became his greatest weapon. While society trains us to fear the stranger in the alley, the aggressive drunk, the person whose instability broadcasts itself through erratic behavior, Evseef operated in the spaces between our collective awareness. He studied the rhythms of the people around him with the patience of a scientist conducting a long-term experiment. He learned their schedules, their habits, their vulnerabilities. He identified the cracks in their defenses. Not the obvious ones, but the subtle openings that appear when someone feels safe, when their guard drops because they believe they're among known quantities. The psychology of his approach revealed something profoundly disturbing about human predation. Evseef didn't select victims through random chance or opportunity alone. He cultivated relationships, however superficial, that positioned him as a non-threat. He understood that the hardest person to defend against is someone you've already categorized as harmless, someone who has earned a small measure of trust through repeated, unremarkable interactions. A neighbor who waves hello, a familiar face at the local shop, someone whose presence has become part of the landscape of everyday life. His methodology demonstrated careful planning that went beyond mere opportunity. He possessed patience that bordered on inhuman, the ability to wait weeks, even months, for the exact confluence of circumstances that would allow him to act with minimal risk of detection. This wasn't impulsive violence driven by uncontrollable urges. This was murder as a craft, refined through iteration and executed with meticulous attention to detail. The first signs that something was wrong came not as a sudden shock but as a creeping unease, a gradual recognition that people were vanishing from the community's collective consciousness. Not all at once, not in a way that immediately triggered alarm, but slowly, like water evaporating from a glass over days. Someone would mention that they hadn't seen so-and-so lately. Another person would note that a familiar face had stopped appearing at their usual haunts. These observations floated through conversations as idle curiosities rather than urgent concerns because people move, people change their routines, people drift away from social circles for countless innocent reasons. Evseef understood this social phenomenon and exploited it brilliantly. He selected individuals whose absence wouldn't immediately generate widespread concern, people living on the margins of social networks, those without close family constantly monitoring their whereabouts, individuals whose daily patterns were irregular enough that their disappearance would initially register as mere deviation rather than crisis. This wasn't coincidence. This was strategy. His victims shared certain characteristics that only became apparent in retrospect, when investigators finally began connecting dots that had seemed unrelated during the crimes themselves. They were often people living alone, individuals whose routines Evseef had observed and mapped with predatory focus. They were people who, at some point, had let Evseef into their personal space, perhaps helping him with some minor task, perhaps sharing a brief conversation that established familiarity, perhaps simply existing in proximity long enough that his presence near their homes or in their vicinity would raise no immediate suspicion. The methods he employed varied, demonstrating both creativity and an understanding of forensic science that suggested research and planning. He avoided repetitive patterns that might alert authorities to a serial predator operating in their midst. Each crime scene told a slightly different story, each approach tailored to the specific circumstances and vulnerabilities of the individual victim. This variation served a dual purpose. It hindered pattern recognition by law enforcement, and it satisfied what appeared to be an intellectual curiosity about the mechanics of death itself. What made Evseef particularly dangerous was his emotional remove from the acts he committed. Witnesses who later provided statements to authorities described him as calm, almost detached, as if he were performing routine tasks rather than ending human lives. This emotional flatness, this absence of the rage or sadistic pleasure often associated with serial violence, suggested something potentially more disturbing. A fundamental disconnect from the humanity of his victims, a capacity to view murder not as a transgression but as simply another activity, morally neutral in his internal calculus. The community of Campadamar Shankaria continued its daily rhythms, unaware that a predator moved among them with increasing confidence. Each successful crime reinforced Evseef's sense of invulnerability, his belief that he had discovered a method that rendered him effectively invisible to the mechanisms of justice. He refined his techniques, learned from minor mistakes, adapted his approach based on what worked and what didn't. He was, in the most horrifying sense, improving at his chosen profession. The psychological profile that would later emerge painted a picture of profound pathology masked by extraordinary self-control. Evseef possessed the ability to compartmentalize his violent acts, to maintain the facade of normalcy even as he planned and executed murders that would haunt investigators for years. He could sit across from neighbors at community gatherings, engage in small talk, express appropriate concern about the growing number of missing persons, all while knowing exactly what had happened to those people, because he had been the architect of their disappearances. This duality, the ability to inhabit both the role of concerned citizen and ruthless killer, required a level of psychological sophistication that went beyond typical criminal behavior. It suggested either a complete absence of empathy or such profound compartmentalization that his actions existed in a sealed mental space, separate from his social identity. Either possibility pointed toward someone operating outside the normal boundaries of human conscience, someone for whom moral constraints had been overridden by other imperatives that remained opaque to outside observers. The first crack in Andrei Evseef's carefully constructed facade appeared not through brilliant detective work, but through the random chaos that undoes even the most meticulous plans. A maintenance worker, conducting routine inspections in a building where Evseef had once lived, discovered an anomaly, structural damage that necessitated opening a sealed wall space. What they found behind that barrier would transform a series of missing persons cases into a full-scale homicide investigation. The remains had been concealed with considerable effort, positioned in a way that suggested both anatomical knowledge and a disturbing comfort with human carnage. The discovery triggered an immediate escalation in law enforcement response, bringing together detectives, forensic specialists, and investigative resources that had previously been scattered across multiple unconnected cases. Suddenly, the disappearances that had seemed like unrelated incidents began forming a pattern that pointed toward a single, methodical killer operating within the community. The forensic examination revealed details that painted a grim picture of Evseef's capabilities. The condition of the remains indicated that he possessed knowledge of how to dismember and dispose of bodies in ways that would hinder identification and investigation. He had taken steps to remove identifying features, to scatter evidence across multiple locations, to create investigative dead ends that would frustrate attempts to connect victims to perpetrator. This wasn't the panicked disposal of evidence by someone who had killed in the heat of passion. This was the calculated cleanup of someone treating murder as a logistical problem requiring systematic solutions. As investigators worked backward from the physical evidence, they began reconstructing timelines and identifying potential victims whose disappearances aligned with Evseef's movements and access to specific locations. The geographic profiling revealed that all the cases clustered around areas where Evseef had lived or worked, creating an invisible web of violence with him at the center. Detectives conducted interviews with anyone who had known him, searching for the moment when his mask might have slipped, when someone might have glimpsed the predator beneath the mundane exterior. Those interviews yielded disturbing insights into how thoroughly Evseef had deceived the people around him. Neighbors described him as quiet but helpful, someone who would assist with carrying groceries or performing small repairs. Colleagues remembered him as competent but unmemorable, the kind of employee who did his work without drawing attention. None of these descriptions matched the profile of a serial killer, which was precisely the point. Evseef had understood that to hunt successfully, he needed to be perceived as harmless, and he had executed that deception with remarkable consistency. The investigation expanded rapidly as authorities recognized they were dealing not with a few isolated incidents, but with a prolonged killing spree that had gone undetected for months, possibly years. Additional crime scenes were identified, each revealing new dimensions of Evseef's methods and the scope of his violence. The body count climbed with each discovery, transforming what had begun as a troubling case into one of the most extensive serial murder investigations the region had ever confronted. Media coverage intensified, bringing national attention to the case and putting enormous pressure on law enforcement to apprehend the person responsible. The community of Campadamar Shankaria found itself thrust into the nightmare of realizing that someone they had walked past, perhaps spoken to, had been systematically killing people around them. The psychological impact rippled through neighborhoods, destroying the fundamental sense of safety that allows communities to function. Trust evaporated. Every interaction became suspect. The social fabric began tearing under the weight of collective paranoia and fear. Meanwhile, Evsif's behavior in the face of mounting scrutiny provided further evidence of his psychological composition. He didn't flee immediately when the investigation began closing in on him. Instead, he maintained his routines, apparently confident that he had covered his tracks sufficiently to evade detection. This wasn't mere arrogance. It was a calculated gamble based on his assessment of the evidence against him and his belief in his ability to continue performing normalcy even under pressure. Surveillance teams observed him going about daily activities with apparent unconcern, displaying none of the nervous behavior typically associated with suspects aware they're under investigation. He went to work, shopped for groceries, maintained social interactions that preserved his facade as just another ordinary citizen. This calmness unnerved investigators, suggesting either genuine confidence in his ability to evade justice or such profound dissociation that he had mentally separated himself from his crimes entirely. The psychological cat-and-mouse game intensified as law enforcement built their case, accumulating evidence while trying to prevent Evsif from becoming aware of how close they were to making an arrest. Every investigative step had to be carefully calibrated to avoid alerting him while simultaneously gathering sufficient proof to ensure conviction. Detectives walked a razor's edge between moving too slowly and allowing potential additional victims, or moving too quickly and compromising the integrity of the case. Physical evidence continued accumulating: DNA matches, forensic connections, digital footprints that placed Evsif at relevant locations during critical timeframes. The circumstantial web tightened incrementally, each new piece of evidence adding weight to the prosecution's eventual case. Forensic accountants traced financial transactions that revealed purchases consistent with the tools and materials needed to commit and cover up murders. Digital forensics uncovered search histories that demonstrated research into methods of killing, body disposal, and evading detection. The mounting evidence painted a picture of someone who had approached murder as a project requiring extensive preparation and ongoing refinement. Evsif had studied his craft, learning from both successes and near misses, constantly adapting his techniques to minimize risk and maximize effectiveness. This intellectual approach to violence set him apart from passion-driven killers or those whose crimes stemmed from psychological compulsion they couldn't control. Evsif chose his path deliberately, executed it methodically, and apparently felt no remorse for the lives he had erased. Families of the missing finally received the terrible closure they had been dreading, confirmation that their loved ones had been murdered. The grief that followed was complicated by rage at how long the killings had continued undetected, by frustration at the failure of systems meant to protect vulnerable community members, by the incomprehensible reality that someone so ordinary-seeming had been capable of such extraordinary evil. Victim impact statements would later reveal the devastating ripple effects of Evsif's crimes. The lives destroyed not just through death, but through the trauma inflicted on everyone connected to those who had vanished. The investigation also exposed systemic failures that had allowed Evsif to operate undetected for so long. Missing persons reports that should have triggered coordinated responses had instead been filed and forgotten, treated as isolated incidents rather than potential indicators of predatory activity. Communication gaps between different jurisdictions had prevented pattern recognition that might have identified a serial offender earlier. The case became a catalyst for reforms in how authorities handle missing persons investigations and coordinate information across agencies. As the noose tightened, the question became not whether Evsif would be arrested, but when, and whether he would surrender peacefully or force a confrontation. Investigators prepared for multiple scenarios, aware that cornering a predator who had killed multiple times carried inherent risks. The operation to take him into custody would require careful planning, overwhelming force, and split-second decision-making to ensure both officer safety and the preservation of evidence crucial to securing convictions. The arrest of Andrei Evsif unfolded not with dramatic confrontation but with calculated precision, a pre-dawn operation designed to minimize risk and maximize the element of surprise. Law enforcement had learned enough about his patterns to know the optimal moment to strike. When he would be isolated, unprepared, unable to access potential weapons or escape routes. The tactical team moved through darkness, surrounding his residence with overwhelming force, transforming his carefully constructed sanctuary into a trap from which there would be no escape. When officers breached the door, they found Evsif in a state of eerie calm, as if he had been expecting this moment and had already resigned himself to its inevitability. He offered no resistance, no desperate attempts to flee or fight, no emotional outburst that might have suggested panic or rage. Instead, he submitted to arrest with the same detached composure he had apparently maintained throughout his killing spree. This unsettling tranquility would characterize all his subsequent interactions with authorities, creating profound unease among those who interrogated him. The search of his residence yielded a trove of evidence that confirmed investigators' worst suspicions and revealed dimensions of his crimes that hadn't yet been discovered. Meticulously organized files documented his victims with the clinical detachment of someone cataloging research subjects rather than human beings he had murdered. Photographs, personal effects taken as trophies, detailed notes about each person's routines and vulnerabilities, all preserved with a level of organization that spoke to the systematic nature of his predation. Most disturbing were the journals in which Evsif had recorded his thoughts and planning in exhaustive detail. These writings provided unprecedented insight into the mind of a serial killer, revealing the cold calculations that had preceded each murder. He wrote about victims as problems to be solved, obstacles to be overcome, experiments in technique and concealment. The complete absence of empathy or recognition of his victims' humanity was more chilling than any expression of sadistic pleasure would have been. He had reduced human beings to abstract challenges, interesting only insofar as they presented opportunities to test and refine his methods. The interrogation process revealed Evsif's unusual psychology further. He neither denied his crimes nor expressed remorse for them. Instead, he discussed them with academic detachment, as if analyzing case studies rather than confessing to murders he had committed. Detectives found this dissociation profoundly unsettling, the complete disconnect between the horror of his actions and the clinical manner in which he described them. He corrected details of investigators' timeline, provided information about cases they hadn't yet connected to him, and explained his decision-making processes with the tone of someone describing routine problem-solving rather than serial murder. Psychologists brought in to evaluate Evsif struggled to categorize him within existing frameworks of criminal psychology. He didn't fit neatly into profiles of serial killers driven by sexual compulsion, those seeking power and control through domination of victims, or those motivated by delusional thinking or auditory hallucinations. Instead, he appeared to represent something rarer and potentially more disturbing. Someone who had consciously chosen to become a killer, approached it as a skill to be developed, and executed his crimes with the emotional investment most people bring to mundane tasks. His confessions, delivered in monotone across multiple interrogation sessions, filled in gaps in the investigation and revealed additional victims whose disappearances hadn't yet been connected to him. Each new revelation expanded the scope of his crimes, pushing the body count higher and extending the timeline of his killing spree further into the past than investigators had initially believed. The sheer number of lives he had taken, combined with the methodical nature of his approach, placed him among the most prolific serial killers in the region's history. The legal proceedings that followed his arrest moved forward with unusual speed, driven by the overwhelming nature of the evidence and Evsif's own confessions. His defense attorneys faced the unenviable task of representing someone who showed no interest in defending himself, who seemed indifferent to the outcome of the trial, who participated in his own prosecution by providing information that only deepened his culpability. The question became not whether he would be convicted, but what sentence would be imposed and whether he would be evaluated as legally sane despite the obvious pathology his crimes revealed. Media coverage reached a fever pitch as details of the case emerged through court filings and testimony. The public struggled to reconcile the mundane appearance of the man in the defendant's chair with the catalog of horrors attributed to him. How could someone so unremarkable have committed such extraordinary evil? The cognitive dissonance troubled observers who wanted killers to look like monsters, to be identifiable through some visible mark of their depravity. Evsif's ordinariness challenged that comforting fiction, forcing confrontation with the reality that predators often hide in plain sight, indistinguishable from everyone else until the mask comes off. Victim families attended hearings, seeking some explanation that might make sense of senseless loss. They watched Evsif display no emotion as prosecutors detailed how their loved ones had died, showed no reaction as evidence of his crimes was presented in clinical detail. His apparent indifference to the pain he had caused became its own form of violence, denying grieving families even the cold comfort of seeing him acknowledge the magnitude of his actions. He remained a cipher, impossible to read, offering no pathway to understanding or closure. The psychiatric evaluations produced conflicting conclusions about Evsif's mental state and capacity for empathy. Some experts argued he met criteria for antisocial personality disorder, exhibiting the hallmark traits of shallow affect, lack of remorse, and instrumental use of other people as means to his ends. Others suggested his profile indicated something beyond standard diagnostic categories, perhaps a fundamental absence of the neural architecture that generates emotional connection to other humans, a neurological variant that rendered him incapable of processing the moral dimension of his actions. These debates carried significant legal implications, as they would influence sentencing recommendations and determine whether Evsif would be housed in a psychiatric facility or a maximum security prison. The question of whether someone who couldn't feel empathy could be held morally responsible for their actions divided expert witnesses and challenged fundamental assumptions about criminal justice. If Evsif genuinely lacked the capacity to comprehend why murder was wrong, did punishment serve any purpose beyond removing him from society? Meanwhile, investigators continued working to identify all of Evsif's victims, giving names to the remains that had been discovered and searching for additional burial sites based on information extracted during interrogations. The grim work of recovery and identification continued for months, each new discovery reopening wounds for families who had hoped against hope that their missing loved ones might still be found alive. The final body count, when it was eventually established, shocked even seasoned investigators who had thought they understood the full scope of his crimes. The psychological impact on the community of Kampadamarshans proved long-lasting and severe. Trust, once shattered, proved difficult to rebuild. Neighbors eyed each other with newfound suspicion. Parents kept children on shorter leashes. The fundamental sense of safety that allows communities to function had been irreparably damaged by the revelation that a serial killer had walked among them undetected for so long. The social fabric, torn by Evsif's crimes, would require years to mend, if it ever fully could. The trial of Andrei Evsif consumed the public consciousness, dominating headlines and filling courtrooms with observers desperate to glimpse the man who had shattered their community's innocence. Prosecutors presented a case built on overwhelming physical evidence, detailed confessions, and testimony from forensic experts who methodically connected each crime to the defendant. The defense, limited in options by their client's own admissions, focused on questions of mental competency and whether Evsif possessed the capacity to form the intent necessary for first-degree murder convictions. Witness testimony painted a devastating picture of lives cut short and families destroyed. Parents spoke about children who would never come home. Siblings described the hollow ache of unanswered questions that had finally been resolved with the worst possible answer. Friends recounted last conversations, final text messages, mundane interactions that became haunted by hindsight once the truth emerged. The cumulative weight of these testimonies transformed abstract body counts into individual tragedies, reminding everyone present that each number represented a unique person with dreams, relationships, and futures that Evsif had erased. Throughout the proceedings, Evsif maintained the same unsettling composure that had characterized his arrest and interrogations. He sat motionless at the defense table, displaying no visible reaction as prosecutors detailed his crimes in graphic terms. This emotional flatness disturbed observers more than theatrical displays of remorse or defiance might have. It suggested such profound disconnect from normal human emotion that people struggled to process what they were witnessing. How could someone hear descriptions of murders they had committed and show no response whatsoever? The jury deliberations were surprisingly brief, the evidence too overwhelming to generate reasonable doubt regardless of questions about mental state. Guilty verdicts on all counts came back with a speed that reflected the strength of the prosecution's case. The only remaining question concerned sentencing. whether Evsif would face execution or spend the remainder of his life imprisoned without possibility of parole. The sentencing phase became a referendum on how society should respond to someone who appeared to exist outside normal moral frameworks, someone for whom punishment might be meaningless because they lacked the capacity to feel remorse. The judge's final pronouncement delivered multiple life sentences, effectively ensuring Evsif would never again walk free regardless of any future legal developments or appeals. The decision reflected both the gravity of his crimes and pragmatic recognition that keeping him isolated from potential victims would be the only way to guarantee public safety. As officers led him from the courtroom for the final time, Evsif showed the same emotionless demeanor he had maintained throughout the trial, offering no final statement, displaying no reaction to his fate. The conclusion of the trial marked the beginning of a different kind of reckoning for Kampatamar Shankaria. The community struggled with questions that had no satisfying answers. How had Evsif operated undetected for so long? What warning signs had been missed? Could the murders have been prevented if different choices had been made? These questions spawned investigations into systemic failures, reforms to missing persons protocols, and painful self-examination about the assumptions that had allowed a predator to hunt so successfully. Law enforcement agencies conducted extensive post-mortem analyses of their response to missing persons reports, identifying numerous points where information had been siloed rather than shared, where patterns had gone unrecognized because different investigators were working from incomplete pictures. The case became a catalyst for developing integrated databases and communication protocols designed to prevent future serial offenders from exploiting jurisdictional gaps. Training programs were revamped to emphasize early recognition of potential serial predation and aggressive pursuit of connections between seemingly unrelated disappearances. Mental health professionals found themselves grappling with what the Evsif case revealed about the limits of psychological understanding. His profile challenged conventional wisdom about serial killers, fitting neither the organized/disorganized dichotomy nor the motivational categories that had structured decades of research. He appeared to represent something rarer, someone who killed not because of psychological compulsion but through what seemed almost like intellectual curiosity about death, combined with complete absence of empathy or moral constraints. Understanding such individuals and potentially identifying them before they act remains an urgent challenge for forensic psychology. The families of Evsif's victims organized support networks, recognizing that their grief was complicated by unique circumstances. Unlike those who lose loved ones to accidents or natural causes, they struggled with the knowledge that their family members had died in terror at the hands of someone who had chosen to kill them. The trauma of that knowledge, combined with the invasive nature of media coverage and legal proceedings, created wounds that would require specialized therapeutic intervention and peer support from others who had experienced similar losses. Some family members channeled their grief into advocacy, pushing for legislative reforms and improved victim services. They testified before governmental bodies about the inadequacy of existing support systems, the secondary trauma inflicted by investigative and legal processes, and the need for better resources to help communities heal after discovering serial predators in their midst. Their efforts produced tangible changes in policy and funding, creating at least some positive legacy from the darkness Evsif had inflicted. The property where Evsif had lived became a focal point for difficult community conversations about how to process spaces tainted by terrible events. Some argued for demolition, removing the physical reminder of what had occurred there. Others advocated for memorialization, ensuring future generations would remember the victims and the lessons their deaths taught. The debate reflected broader struggles with memory and meaning-making in the aftermath of incomprehensible evil. Years after his conviction, Evsif continues to generate uncomfortable fascination from researchers studying extreme criminal psychology. He receives regular requests for interviews from academics, authors, and documentary filmmakers seeking to understand what drives someone to become a serial killer through apparent choice rather than irresistible compulsion. Most of these requests go unanswered. Evsif apparently sees no purpose in engaging with people attempting to understand him, maintaining the same detachment in prison that characterized his freedom. The few communications he has permitted reveal no evolution in his self-awareness or emotional capacity. He discusses his crimes in the same clinical terms he used during confessions, showing neither pride nor regret, treating murder as a topic of purely academic interest. This consistency suggests his psychological profile hasn't been merely a performance but represents something fundamental about how his mind processes morality and human life. He remains, in the assessment of those who have studied him most closely, profoundly disconnected from the emotional reality that shapes most human behavior. The community of Kampadamar Shankaria slowly rebuilt its shattered sense of security, though the process remains incomplete and perhaps always will be. Trust, once destroyed so thoroughly, never fully returns to its previous state. People who lived through the revelation of Evsif's crimes carry permanent wariness, an understanding that evil can wear an unremarkable face, and that the person next door might harbor secrets darker than imagination could conjure. This knowledge changes how communities function, introducing elements of suspicion and vigilance that replace the easy familiarity that once existed. Educational institutions incorporated the Evsif case into criminology curricula as an example of predatory behavior that challenges conventional profiling. Students learn not only about his methods but about the systemic failures that allowed him to operate undetected and the reforms those failures inspired. The case serves as a reminder that understanding criminal psychology requires constant evolution as new variants of predatory behavior emerge that don't fit established patterns. The true scope of Evsif's crimes may never be fully known. Despite extensive searches and his own confessions, investigators suspect there may be additional victims whose remains haven't been recovered, whose disappearances haven't been definitively connected to him. Families of long-missing persons still wonder whether their loved ones might have encountered Evsif, whether cold cases gathering dust in file cabinets might finally be solved if new evidence emerged. This uncertainty adds another layer of trauma, leaving some people trapped in limbo between hope and despair. The lasting legacy of Andrei Evsif extends beyond the specific crimes he committed to broader questions about human nature and the existence of individuals who appear to operate outside moral frameworks that constrain most behavior. His case challenges comfortable assumptions about the universality of empathy and conscience, forcing confrontation with the disturbing reality that some people simply lack the internal mechanisms that prevent most humans from harming others. Understanding how such individuals develop, whether their condition can be identified early, and what society's response should be when they're discovered remains among the most pressing challenges in forensic psychology and criminal justice. The story of Kampadamar Shankaria and the monster who walked among its people serves as a stark reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious signs. Sometimes the most dangerous predators are those who have mastered the art of appearing harmless, who understand that the best camouflage is ordinariness. The victims of Andrei Evsif paid the ultimate price for the collective failure to recognize that threat until far too late. Their memory demands vigilance, systemic reform, and recognition that protecting communities requires confronting uncomfortable truths about human nature's darkest possibilities. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story to help you drift off to sleep. Now, let's move on to our third story. Story 3: The Mannequin Collector. Some doors should never be opened. What they found inside turned seasoned detectives into sleepless survivors. The apartment door swung open to reveal a nightmare dressed in ordinary wallpaper and aging furniture. Detective Yuri Volkov had kicked down hundreds of doors during his 23 years on the Moscow police force, but nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared him for what waited beyond that threshold on a frozen February morning in 2017. The smell hit first: decay wrapped in cheap perfume, sugar rotting in summer heat, death trying desperately to wear a pleasant mask. Then came the dolls. Hundreds of them, thousands perhaps, their glassy eyes tracking movement that wasn't there, their porcelain faces frozen in expressions that seemed to shift when you looked away. But the dolls weren't the horror. They were merely the wrapping paper around something infinitely worse. In the bedroom, arranged with the meticulous care of a museum curator, sat the real collection. 7 women, mummified, dressed, positioned like guests at an eternal tea party. Their clothes, Vintage dresses from decades past had been changed repeatedly, their makeup freshly applied, their hair styled with obsessive precision. This wasn't murder. This was something that had transcended murder and entered a realm where language itself broke down. This was the private universe of Anatoly Moskvin, a man whose brilliance had curdled into madness, whose loneliness had metastasized into monstrosity. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Every nightmare has a beginning, and this one started with missing graves and a historian who knew too much about the dead. Nizhny Novgorod sprawls along the Volga River like a sleeping giant, its golden-domed churches piercing gray skies, its Soviet-era apartment blocks standing like tombstones for forgotten ideologies. In this city of 1.2 million souls, cemeteries dot the landscape like punctuation marks in a sentence about mortality. Old graveyards with Orthodox crosses tilting drunkenly in the permafrost. New memorial parks with granite headstones reflecting the weak Russian sun. And wandering between them, notebook in hand, walked a figure who seemed to belong to neither the living nor the dead. Anatoly Moskvin cut an unusual silhouette against the cemetery gates. Thin to the point of gauntness, his frame swallowed by oversized coats that had seen better decades, he moved with the peculiar grace of someone comfortable among the deceased. His face, pale, almost translucent in certain lights, bore the marks of extreme intelligence. Sharp eyes that absorbed everything, a mouth that rarely smiled but often whispered. At 45 years old, he had spent more of his life studying the dead than engaging with the living. His credentials were impeccable and terrifying in their scope. Moskvin spoke 13 languages fluently, could read in another dozen, and held advanced degrees in Celtic studies and journalism. He had authored scholarly papers on funeral rites, burial practices, and death rituals across cultures. Universities occasionally hired him as a lecturer. Local newspapers published his articles on historical sites and archaeological discoveries. He was, by every measurable standard, a genius. But genius without emotional anchors becomes something else entirely. Moskvin's obsession began, as so many obsessions do, with genuine academic curiosity. In the early 2000s, he started documenting every cemetery in the Nizhny Novgorod region. Not just the famous ones, not just the well-maintained memorial parks, but every burial ground. Abandoned Orthodox graveyards where tombstones sank into earth like drowning men, potter's fields where the unnamed rested, even illegal dump sites where desperate families had buried loved ones without permits or prayers. He walked these grounds in all seasons. Winter, when snow transformed graveyards into blank pages waiting for his footnotes. Spring, when thawing ground released the sweet sick smell of decomposition into the air. Summer, when wildflowers grew between headstones like beauty refusing to acknowledge death. Autumn, when falling leaves covered inscriptions and erased names from memory. His notebooks multiplied, hundreds of pages filled with meticulous observations, GPS coordinates, epitaph transcriptions, sketches of grave markers, notes on soil composition and decay rates. He photographed thousands of graves, documenting the slow erasure of identity that death brings. Fellow historians occasionally joined him, impressed by his thoroughness, unsettled by his intensity. He would stand at a child's grave for 20 minutes, one colleague later recalled, not praying, not exactly mourning, just absorbing it somehow, like he was trying to download their entire existence into his brain. The year 2005 marked a transformation. Moskvin attended the funeral of an 11-year-old girl named Olga Shardimova, struck by a car while walking home from school. He didn't know the family. He had no connection to the child. But he appeared at the cemetery, standing at the back of the mourners, his pale face expressionless as the small casket descended into frozen ground. Something broke inside him that day, or perhaps something that had always been broken finally shattered completely. He began visiting Olga's grave daily, weekly, monthly. Years passed, and he continued his pilgrimages, leaving flowers, cleaning the headstone, sitting beside the plot in conversations no one else could hear. Parents visiting nearby graves grew accustomed to the strange, thin man who whispered to the earth. Groundskeepers recognized his stooped figure among the tombstones. He became part of the cemetery's furniture, as permanent and unremarkable as the iron fence surrounding the grounds. But Moskvin was evolving, his fascination deepening into something darker and more possessive. He started collecting items from graves, a ribbon here, a photograph there, toys left by grieving families, small thefts that seemed harmless, the actions of an eccentric unable to distinguish appropriate boundaries. Cemetery workers noticed but rarely intervened. What harm could he do to the dead? His apartment, a cramped two-room space in a decaying Soviet-era building, transformed into a shrine. Every surface held some funerary artifact, religious icons stolen from graves, dolls that had been buried with children, wreaths preserved long past their expiration date. His elderly parents, with whom he shared the apartment, watched this accumulation with growing concern but said nothing. Their son was strange, yes, obsessive, certainly, but dangerous, never. By 2007, Moskvin had visited and documented 752 cemeteries. He had walked more than 10,000 kilometers on foot, crisscrossing the region like a spider mapping its web. He could recite the epitaphs of hundreds of graves from memory. He knew which plots were visited regularly and which had been abandoned to time. He understood the rhythms of grief, how frequently flowers were replaced when families stopped coming. And he had identified the perfect candidates for his next phase of research. They were all young girls, aged 3 to 15. All had died tragically. Accidents, illnesses, sudden catastrophes that left families shattered. All were buried in graves that, over time, received fewer visitors. The forgotten daughters, the abandoned children, the dead who were dying a second death as memory itself eroded. Moskvin told himself he was preserving them, honoring them, rescuing them from the cold indifference of earth and decay. His journals from this period reveal a mind constructing elaborate justifications for the unjustifiable. "The grave is abandonment," he wrote. "True love means never letting go." On a moonless night in October 2007, Anatoly Moskvin returned to a cemetery he had visited dozens of times before. He carried a shovel, a flashlight, and a backpack containing plastic sheeting and disinfectant. The grave he chose belonged to a 10-year-old girl who had died 3 years earlier. Her parents had moved to another city. Months had passed since anyone had left flowers. For hours later, he emerged from the cemetery carrying something wrapped in plastic sheeting. His hands shook. His breath came in rapid gasps. But his eyes, witnesses later recalled, held an expression approaching religious ecstasy. The mannequin collector had claimed his first doll. Transforming a corpse into a companion requires specific skills, particular knowledge, and a complete disconnection from human empathy. Anatoly Moskvin possessed all three in abundance. His expertise in historical burial practices gave him detailed understanding of mummification techniques. Ancient Egyptians, Celtic bog burials, Orthodox Christian preservation methods. He had studied them all academically, never imagining he would apply this knowledge in his cramped apartment while his elderly parents slept in the next room. The first body, exhumed from that October cemetery, presented immediate challenges. 3 years of burial had begun the process of decomposition, breaking down soft tissues, bloating the corpse with gases, transforming recognizable humanity into something alien and frightening. Most people would have recoiled. Moskvin saw only a restoration project. He worked methodically, applying techniques cobbled together from mortuary science textbooks, taxidermy manuals, and medieval preservation methods. The body was washed repeatedly in solutions of salt and disinfectant. Cavities were stuffed with fabric soaked in preservatives. The skin, where it remained intact, was treated with mixtures of beeswax and oils. Where decomposition had progressed too far, he made repairs using cloth, papier-mâché, and eventually, doll parts scavenged from toy stores and secondhand shops. The process took weeks. The smell, despite his chemical interventions, was overwhelming. But Moskvin seemed immune to it, or perhaps his senses had been recalibrated by obsession. He worked behind locked doors, playing classical music to mask any sounds, timing his activities around his parents' schedules and sleeping patterns. When he finished, what remained bore only superficial resemblance to the child who had been buried. The body, now mummified, hollow, weighing less than 20 pounds, was dressed in clothing Moskvin had purchased from vintage stores. A wig covered the skull. Makeup, applied with surprising skill, gave the face a doll-like appearance. Glass eyes replaced empty sockets. He positioned his creation in the corner of his bedroom, propped against the wall like an oversized toy, and he spoke to it for hours, sharing his day, discussing his research, reading passages from books in languages living people around him couldn't understand. The psychological mechanism behind Moskvin's actions reveals itself in his journals, discovered later during the investigation. He had convinced himself these were not corpses but rescued children. Not dead but sleeping, not stolen but saved from abandonment. His writing shows a mind performing spectacular gymnastics to avoid confronting reality. She smiled when I changed her dress today. He wrote about a corpse that had been dead for 5 years. She prefers the blue one, but one companion wasn't enough. Moskvin's appetite, now awakened, demanded expansion. Between 2007 and 2011, he refined his technique. Each exhumation became more efficient, each cemetery visit more calculated. He studied patrol patterns of security guards, identified blind spots in surveillance, chose graves in remote sections where his digging would go unnoticed. He became a specialist in his grotesque craft, improving his mummification methods with each body, reducing the time required from weeks to days. His target selection followed disturbing patterns. He exclusively chose girls between 3 and 15 years old. He preferred graves that were at least 2 years old, allowing sufficient time for families to reduce visitation frequency, but not so old that decomposition made preservation impossible. He avoided freshly buried bodies. The risk of discovery was too high, and those buried more than a decade, where skeletal remains offered insufficient material for his purposes. Cemetery records, analyzed later by investigators, showed 26 graves in the region had been disturbed between 2007 and 2011. Not all disturbances could be definitively linked to Moskvin. Animals sometimes dig, ground subsides, vandals occasionally desecrate graves for incomprehensible reasons. But investigators believed at least 15 graves had been opened by the same careful hand. Not all exhumations proved successful. Some bodies had decomposed beyond Moskvin's ability to preserve them. Others, when examined in the harsh light of his apartment, failed to meet whatever criteria governed his selection. These failures were reinterred, returned to Earth with evidence of disturbance but without police involvement. Until investigators began specifically looking for exhumation evidence, these violations went unnoticed. The successful extractions, however, populated his apartment like attendees at a macabre garden party. By 2011, 7 mummified bodies resided in his bedroom, arranged in various poses, sitting in chairs, positioned on shelves, propped against walls. Each wore different outfits, changed regularly. Each had been given names, identities divorced from their original lives. Moskvin created elaborate backstories for his dolls, writing detailed histories that existed purely in his fractured imagination. His parents, elderly and increasingly infirm, occupied the adjacent room. How could they not know? This question haunted investigators. The smell alone should have alerted them, but Moskvin was clever. He sealed his bedroom door with weather stripping. He burned incense constantly. He told his parents he was conducting research involving historical artifacts that required climate control and privacy. They were elderly, trusting, and increasingly dependent on him for care. They asked few questions, and he provided fewer answers. The dolls themselves, traditional manufactured dolls, not the corpse dolls, multiplied even faster than his mummified collection. Moskvin filled his apartment with hundreds, possibly thousands of ceramic, porcelain, and plastic dolls. They covered surfaces, lined shelves, hung from walls. This visible collection served dual purposes. It satisfied his genuine fascination with dolls and provided camouflage for the human remains hidden among them. To casual observers, he was an eccentric collector of unusual items. Nothing more sinister than that. His daily routine acquired eerie normalcy. Mornings were spent in libraries and archives, continuing his legitimate historical research. Afternoons involved cemetery visits, now serving the dual purpose of documentation and target identification. Evenings belonged to his collection. He changed their clothes like a child playing with dolls. He repositioned them for variety. He photographed them obsessively, creating albums that would later provide investigators with irrefutable evidence. Most disturbingly, he spoke to them as equals. Conversations overheard through thin apartment walls, dismissed by neighbors as a man talking to himself, actually represented his interactions with corpses he believed were listening, responding, engaging. Moskvin's journals from this period show accelerating mental deterioration. Earlier entries, while disturbing, maintained some connection to reality. But by 2010, his writing revealed complete immersion in delusion. Natasha wants to visit the cemetery where she used to live, he wrote. I explained that it's too dangerous. People wouldn't understand our family. Our family. That phrase appeared repeatedly. He had constructed a fantasy wherein these mummified remains were his daughters, his sisters, his companions in isolation. The fact that they were corpses, stolen, desecrated, violations of everything sacred about death and burial, had been completely rewritten in his mind. But even the most careful monsters eventually make mistakes. And Moskvin's unraveling began not with criminal investigation but with parents who refused to let memory die. Natalia Solovayova visited her daughter's grave every Sunday without fail. Rain, snow, brutal cold. Nothing kept her from that weekly pilgrimage to the cemetery on the outskirts of Nizhny Novgorod, where 10-year-old Dasha rested beneath a white marble headstone decorated with carved angels. Dasha had died in 2008, 3 years before that October morning in 2011, when Natalia arrived at the cemetery carrying fresh flowers and found her daughter's grave disturbed. Not obviously vandalized, not covered in graffiti or overturned, just wrong. The earth looked different, settled unevenly. A crack had appeared in the grave border, and when Natalia knelt to arrange flowers in the vase, she noticed something that froze her blood. The soil was loose, recently disturbed, with none of the compacted hardness that comes from years of weather and settlement. She called cemetery administration immediately. Groundskeepers investigated, dismissing her concerns initially. Graves settle over time, they explained. Animals sometimes dig. Nothing sinister here, but Natalia insisted. She knew her daughter's grave intimately, visited weekly, noticed every subtle change. This wasn't settling. This was disturbance. Reluctantly, officials agreed to open the grave. What they found, or rather what they didn't find, triggered an investigation that would ultimately expose one of Russia's most shocking crimes. The coffin remained intact, undamaged. But inside, where Dasha's body should have been, they found only her funeral clothes, carefully folded, and a collection of dolls arranged where her corpse once lay. Someone had opened the grave, removed the body with surgical precision, and replaced it with toys, as if this substitution might somehow prevent discovery. Police were contacted. Detective Yuri Volkov, veteran investigator with the Regional Criminal Division, took the case. Initially, he suspected black market organ harvesting or medical school body snatching, crimes known to occur in Russia's underfunded regions. But the dolls troubled him. Organ thieves didn't leave calling cards. Body snatchers worked with professional efficiency, not theatrical substitutions. Then more reports arrived. Another family, visiting their 8-year-old son's grave, noticed similar disturbances. Then another. Within 2 weeks, 5 families had reported irregularities at their children's graves. When these were exhumed for verification, investigators found the same pattern. Bodies gone, replaced with dolls or children's toys, coffins resealed with evident care. The cemetery pattern emerged quickly. All violated graves belonged to young girls, aged 3 to 15. All had been buried at least 2 years previously, but no more than 7. All graves showed similar disturbance patterns: careful excavation, precise coffin opening, meticulous reburial. This wasn't random vandalism. This was systematic collection by someone who knew exactly what they wanted and had refined their technique through repetition. Volkov expanded the investigation. Officers visited every cemetery in a 100-kilometer radius, examining graves matching the profile. They found 13 additional sites showing evidence of disturbance. Some had been violated years earlier, the evidence weathered and overlooked. Cemetery records, poorly maintained in many locations, provided incomplete information. Investigators faced a horrifying reality. They might never know the full scope of desecration. Media coverage intensified. Parents across the region descended on cemeteries, demanding their children's graves be checked. Mass exhumations began, each one revealing more horror. By November 2011, authorities had confirmed 26 violated graves. The public demanded answers. Politicians called for immediate arrests. But Volkov had no suspects, no leads, no direction except the disturbing question: what was someone doing with the bodies? The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Cemetery workers, interviewed as potential witnesses, mentioned the eccentric historian who visited constantly. He was harmless, they assured investigators. Just a scholar documenting graves, strange but non-threatening. He'd been around for years, walking the same paths, photographing the same tombstones. One detail caught Volkov's attention. This historian paid particular attention to children's graves, often spending extended periods at sites belonging to young girls. And according to records, his visits had increased significantly around 2007, roughly when the desecrations began. Identifying Anatoly Moskvin took less than a day. His published papers and newspaper articles created a clear trail. His association with multiple universities and historical societies was documented. Finding him was simple. He lived with his parents in a rundown apartment complex, walked the same routes daily, followed predictable patterns. Surveillance began immediately. For 2 weeks, officers tracked Moskvin's movements, photographed his cemetery visits, documented his routines. Nothing in his behavior seemed overtly suspicious. He visited cemeteries during daylight hours, took photographs, made notes in his notebooks. He maintained his eccentric appearance, oversized coats, disheveled hair, but showed no awareness of police attention. Then investigators received authorization for a search warrant. The stated reason: possible evidence relating to cemetery desecration. The actual goal: determining whether this strange scholar was their perpetrator or merely an odd tangent in a widening investigation. On December 1st, 2011, Detective Yuri Volkov and 6 officers approached Moskvin's apartment building. The structure, built in the 1970s during the Soviet era, was indistinguishable from thousands of similar buildings. Gray concrete, small windows, narrow hallways that smelled of cabbage and despair. They climbed to the 3rd floor, knocked on apartment 23, and heard shuffling footsteps approaching. Anatoly Moskvin opened the door wearing stained sweatpants and an expression of mild curiosity. Behind him, visible through the doorway, officers saw walls covered in dolls. Hundreds of them, creating a kaleidoscope of porcelain faces and glassy eyes. Anatoly Moskvin? Volkov held up his badge. "We have authorization to search your premises." Moskvin stepped aside without protest, gesturing them in with unsettling politeness. "Of course, please be careful where you step. My collection is quite extensive." Officers entered, immediately overwhelmed by the sheer quantity of dolls. They covered every surface: shelves, tables, chairs, even portions of the floor. The smell hit next, perfume masking something organic and wrong, like rot wrapped in flowers. And then, as officers moved deeper into the apartment, they reached the bedroom. The door was closed. Moskvin positioned himself in front of it, suddenly anxious. "That room contains my most valuable pieces. Very delicate. Perhaps I should." "Step aside, please." Volkov's hand moved instinctively to his weapon, though he didn't draw it. The door opened, and 7 pairs of glass eyes stared back from faces that weren't quite right, from bodies positioned too carefully, from figures that occupied the uncanny valley between doll and corpse. Volkov had seen many horrors during his career: murder scenes, accident victims, decomposed bodies in advanced states of decay. But nothing prepared him for this carefully curated collection of the dead, dressed and positioned like participants in a child's tea party. One officer vomited immediately. Another stumbled backward, crossing himself repeatedly. Volkov stood frozen, his mind struggling to process what his eyes reported. These weren't dolls. These weren't mannequins. These were human remains, mummified and dressed, arranged throughout the bedroom like furniture. "They're beautiful, aren't they?" Moskvin's voice came from behind them, carrying genuine pride. "I saved them, all of them. They were alone, forgotten. Now they're loved." The arrest happened in slow motion. Officers moved mechanically, placing handcuffs on Moskvin's wrists. Reading rights he probably didn't comprehend. He didn't resist, didn't run. Just looked back at his bedroom with an expression of such profound sadness that several officers, hardened professionals all, felt uncomfortable meeting his gaze. Forensic teams arrived. Photographers documented everything. Specialists began the grim work of identifying remains and matching them to the violated graves. The apartment became a crime scene, sealed and studied, every detail cataloged for the prosecution that would inevitably follow. In the hallway outside, Moskvin's elderly parents sat in chairs provided by neighbors, their faces registering incomprehension. "He was always so quiet," his mother whispered, "so gentle. He would never hurt anyone." But Anatoly Moskvin hadn't hurt the living. His victims were already dead, which somehow made his crimes even more disturbing. A violation of the boundary between life and death itself, a desecration so profound that language struggled to contain it. The media exploded. International news outlets picked up the story within hours. "Russia's doll collector," the headlines screamed. "Cemetery cannibal caught." Though Moskvin hadn't cannibalized anyone, his crimes were preservation, not consumption. Accuracy mattered less than sensation. Across Nizhny Novgorod, parents who thought their grief had reached its nadir discovered new depths of horror. Their daughters hadn't rested peacefully. Their bodies had been stolen, violated, transformed into components of a madman's collection. The desecration of death, already terrible, was compounded by years of unknowing, years when they'd visited empty graves and spoken to absent daughters. The investigation expanded. How many graves had Moskvin violated? How many bodies remained unfound? His journals provided partial answers. He documented his exhumations with scholarly precision, but some entries were coded or ambiguous. Investigators ultimately confirmed 7 bodies recovered from his apartment, with strong evidence suggesting at least 8 more graves had been violated, though those remains were never found. As December 2011 turned to January 2012, Russia grappled with questions that had no satisfying answers. How does such obsession develop? What transforms academic interest into criminal compulsion? And most troubling, how many other Anatoly Moskvins walk among us, their madness hidden behind credentials and politeness? Anatoly Moskvin's psychiatric evaluation began in January 2012, conducted in a secure facility designed for Russia's most disturbed offenders. The assessment would ultimately determine whether he faced criminal trial or permanent psychiatric commitment, whether the state viewed him as evil or insane. Dr. Pavel Romanov, chief psychiatrist assigned to the case, approached his subject with professional curiosity and personal dread. He'd evaluated murderers, rapists, terrorists, humanity's darkest expressions, but Moskvin presented something different. A man who'd committed unspeakable acts without apparent malice, whose crimes sprang from twisted love rather than hatred. Their first session occurred in a sparse consultation room, Moskvin seated across a metal table, his thin frame nearly disappearing into an oversized prison jumpsuit. He appeared cooperative, even eager to discuss his actions. No attempts at manipulation, no protests of innocence, just calm explanation of behavior he genuinely believed was justified. You want to understand why Moskvin began before Romanov could speak. Everyone wants to understand, but you're asking the wrong question. You should ask, why did no one else see what I saw? And what did you see? Abandonment. Everywhere, abandonment. Children buried and forgotten. Graves that never see flowers. Names weathered off headstones. That's the real crime, doctor. The true desecration. I didn't violate those girls. I rescued them. This delusion, persistent, elaborate, impermeable to reason, formed the core of Moskvin's psychological profile. Extensive testing revealed his cognitive functioning remained intact. He could perform complex logical operations, discuss academic topics with remarkable sophistication, demonstrate clear memory and reasoning skills. But when the subject turned to his collection, reality fractured completely. He genuinely believed the mummified corpses were alive. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, actually literally alive. He described conversations with them, personality traits they exhibited, preferences they expressed. When shown photographs of the bodies discovered in his apartment, obvious corpses, undeniable remains, he insisted they were merely sleeping or shy or uncomfortable with cameras. Natasha doesn't like photographs, he explained, pointing to one particularly decomposed corpse. She's very modest. I respect that. Romanov's evaluation, submitted after 3 months of intensive assessment, concluded that Moskvin suffered from paranoid schizophrenia compounded by severe obsessive-compulsive disorder and dissociative episodes. The diagnosis carried significant legal implications. Under Russian law, individuals deemed legally insane cannot stand criminal trial but must be committed to psychiatric facilities until deemed no longer a danger to society. The prosecution, representing families of the victims, fought this conclusion. They argued Moskvin's careful planning, his systematic approach to exhumation, and his successful concealment for years demonstrated criminal intent and rational thinking. Insane people don't refine techniques over time. Crazy people don't evade detection for 4 years. But Dr. Romanov's testimony proved compelling. Mr. Moskvin planned his actions carefully because he has high intelligence, the psychiatrist explained to the court. But his goals, his understanding of what he was doing, remained completely divorced from reality. He believed he was performing rescue operations, not committing crimes. That's not evil. That's illness. The trial, held in summer 2012, attracted international attention. Media filled the courtroom, cameras forbidden but notebooks furiously documenting every detail. Families of victims sat in the front rows, their faces registering emotions beyond vocabulary. Grief compounded by violation, horror layered with incomprehension. Moskvin himself appeared calm throughout proceedings, occasionally puzzled by accusations. When prosecutors detailed his crimes, the exhumations, the desecrations, the years of living with corpses, he nodded agreement with facts while rejecting their characterization. Yes, he'd taken the bodies. Yes, he'd kept them in his apartment. But he hadn't desecrated anyone. He'd provided care, love, attention. Couldn't they see the difference? The most devastating testimony came from families describing the moment they learned their daughters' graves were empty. Natalia Solovyova, Dasha's mother, spoke for them all. I visited her every week for 3 years. I brought flowers. I talked to her. I believed she was there, resting peacefully. But she wasn't there. She'd been taken, dressed up like a toy, kept in that place. He stole her twice, once from life, once from death. There's no forgiveness for that. Moskvin listened without apparent emotion. When given opportunity to address the families, he declined through his attorney. What could he possibly say that wouldn't compound their anguish? Expert witnesses provided context that was both illuminating and disturbing. Anthropologists explained that necrophilia, sexual attraction to corpses, didn't apply here. Moskvin showed no evidence of sexual motivation. His crimes weren't about gratification but companionship, a profoundly lonely man creating a family from the only people who wouldn't reject him, the dead. Psychologists discussed his childhood. Socially isolated, intellectually gifted but emotionally stunted, bullied by peers, neglected by parents too busy with their own troubles. He'd learned early that books were safer than people, that the dead, memorialized in history and biography, were more reliable than the living. His adult life simply extended that childhood lesson to its grotesque conclusion. Forensic experts described the mummification process, detailing the skill and knowledge required. Moskvin hadn't simply hoarded corpses. He'd preserved them, maintained them, demonstrating technical expertise that would qualify him for mortuary science if deployed legally. This expertise, paradoxically, made his crimes both more impressive and more horrifying. The bodies themselves became evidence. 7 mummified remains, identified through dental records and DNA comparison, were presented to the court in sealed containers. Families were spared viewing them, mercy granted by judges who understood some sites inflict permanent damage, but their presence in the courtroom created palpable tension. Investigators testified about evidence found in Moskvin's apartment beyond the bodies. Hundreds of photographs documenting his collection, journals detailing exhumations, receipts for clothing and dolls purchased to dress his companions. The sheer volume of documentation revealed a man who never questioned his actions, who treated his crimes as legitimate activities worthy of record-keeping. Most chilling were the videos. Moskvin had filmed his family, creating hours of footage showing him changing their clothes, repositioning them, conducting one-sided conversations about daily events. In one particularly disturbing clip, he celebrated a birthday, complete with cake and candles, singing to a corpse propped in a chair. His happiness in these videos was genuine, heartbreaking in its sincerity, a madman's joy in what he believed was domestic normalcy. The defense presented their case. Moskvin was profoundly ill, required treatment not punishment, posed no danger if properly medicated and monitored. Psychiatric hospitals, not prisons, provided appropriate containment. He hadn't acted from malice but from delusion. Punishing him accomplished nothing beyond vengeance. The prosecution countered. Some crimes transcend mental illness as explanation or excuse. 7 families would never recover from this trauma. Countless others lived with uncertainty about whether their own deceased relatives had been violated. Justice demanded more than medical diagnosis and therapeutic intervention. The verdict, delivered in August 2012, satisfied no one. Judge Mikhail Petrov ruled that Moskvin was legally insane at the time of his crimes and therefore could not be held criminally responsible. He would be committed indefinitely to a secure psychiatric facility, receiving mandatory treatment until such time, if ever, that psychiatric evaluators deemed him safe for release. This court recognizes the profound suffering inflicted on victims' families, Petrov stated. No sentence can repair that damage. No legal proceeding can restore what was stolen. But neither can we punish a man who lacks fundamental understanding of his actions. Mr. Moskvin will remain confined, treated, and monitored. Should he ever achieve mental clarity sufficient to understand the enormity of his crimes, that awareness will constitute its own terrible punishment. Families wept, whether from relief, frustration, or exhaustion, perhaps even they couldn't say. Moskvin showed no reaction, his face as blank as the porcelain dolls he'd surrounded himself with. The aftermath proved complicated. The 7 recovered bodies were returned to families for proper reburial, though some families refused them, too disturbed by their years in Moskvin's apartment to accept the remains as truly their daughters. These were cremated and interred in anonymous graves. Moskvin's elderly parents, collateral victims of their son's madness, faced harassment and threats. They maintained ignorance of his activities. Investigators found no evidence they knew, but public opinion proved less forgiving. They eventually relocated, disappearing into Russia's vastness, their remaining years shadowed by their son's infamy. The apartment building where Moskvin lived became infamous. Tenants moved out. Property values plummeted. Eventually, the entire structure was condemned and demolished, not for structural reasons, but because no one wanted to live where such horror had occurred. The site remains empty, a weedy lot where children don't play and developers don't build. Moskvin himself resides in a secure psychiatric facility outside Moscow. Reports filter out occasionally. He remains delusional, still insisting his actions were appropriate, still failing to grasp the monstrosity of his crimes. Doctors working with him describe a man trapped in permanent dissociation, unable or unwilling to rejoin consensus reality. His case sparked broader discussions throughout Russia and internationally. How do societies identify and intercept individuals sliding toward such extreme deviance? What responsibility do communities bear for isolated, clearly troubled individuals living among them? Can academic brilliance coexist with such profound moral blindness? These questions remain unanswered. Anatoly Moskvin's crimes defy easy categorization, resist simple explanation. He wasn't a typical serial killer. He didn't murder. He didn't physically harm the living. Yet what he did, the desecration of death itself, the violation of humanity's most sacred boundary, somehow feels worse than conventional murder. The families continue their lives, carrying scars that will never heal. They visit new graves, where their daughters finally rest undisturbed. They organize support groups, speaking publicly about their experiences despite the pain it causes, hoping that awareness might prevent future atrocities. They endure because what else can they do? And in cemeteries across Nizhny Novgorod, security has increased. Cameras monitor graveyards. Patrols check for disturbances. Families install more secure caskets, add extra barriers between their deceased loved ones and the world. Because once you know such desecration is possible, innocence becomes impossible. The boundary between life and death, once assumed inviolate, has been revealed as permeable. And that knowledge, once acquired, can never be unknown. Anatoly Moskvin created more than 7 mummified victims. He created a wound in the collective psyche, a reminder that the darkness in human consciousness extends further than comfortable imagination allows. His crimes weren't motivated by lust or greed or rage, emotions we understand, however much we condemn them. They sprang from loneliness and delusion, making them somehow more disturbing because they suggest that love itself, when twisted by madness, can produce horrors equal to any hatred. The dolls, hundreds of them recovered from his apartment, were destroyed, burned in industrial incinerators, their ashes scattered without ceremony. They were just objects, innocent of their owner's madness, but no one wanted them. They'd witnessed too much. They carried too many memories. Only the story remains, passed between people in whispered conversations, researched by criminologists and psychologists, sensationalized in documentaries and true crime recountings. It persists because it disturbs something fundamental in us, the hope that death, at least, offers peace and permanence, that we can finally rest without fear of violation. Anatoly Moskvin proved that hope was just another illusion, and that may be his most lasting crime, teaching us that nowhere, not even the grave, offers absolute sanctuary from human darkness. The mannequin collector collected more than bodies. He collected innocence, peace, the fundamental human need to believe that some boundaries cannot be crossed. And he shattered them all with the precision of a scholar and the soul of a monster who never realized he was monstrous. That's the true nightmare. Not that such people exist, but that they genuinely believe they're doing good. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and subscribe so you never miss the next true crime story to help you unwind. Now, let's get into our final story. Story 4, The Anatomy Lesson. Some men dissect life to understand it. Others dissect the living to destroy it. Behind the white coat and surgical mask lived a demon who understood the fragility of human flesh better than most, because he had spent years learning exactly where to cut. Moscow, 1921. While a ravaged nation bled from revolution and civil war, one man discovered that chaos makes the perfect cover for atrocity. Dr. Vasily Komarov wasn't just a horse trader scratching out survival in post-revolutionary Russia. He was an architect of annihilation who transformed his modest home into an abattoir of human suffering. Between those walls, at least 33 souls, though likely many more, met endings so barbaric that even hardened investigators would spend nights unable to close their eyes. This is the story of the man they called the Wolf of Moscow, a predator who didn't hunt in shadows but invited victims into his home with promises of work, shelter, and hope. What they found instead was a methodical butcher who treated human beings like livestock and who very nearly got away with it all. Because in a country drowning in bodies, who notices a few more corpses in the ground? Moscow, August 1921. The city stank of death, but that was nothing unusual. 3 years after the Bolsheviks had seized control, the capital remained a skeleton of its former grandeur. Famine gripped the countryside. Typhus swept through overcrowded tenements. Bodies appeared in alleyways with such regularity that pedestrians had learned to simply step around them. Their faces turned away, their consciences carefully shuttered. Death had become so commonplace that it barely registered anymore. Just another corpse. Just another tragedy in a nation built on them. The house at 26 Sadovaya Street looked unremarkable from the outside. A 2-story wooden structure with peeling paint and a garden that had gone slightly wild. Its owner, Vasily Komarov, kept largely to himself. Neighbors knew him as a horse trader, a man who made his living in the brutal post-war economy by buying and selling whatever beasts of burden hadn't yet been slaughtered for meat. He was 50 years old, with a face that seemed carved from granite, all sharp angles and cold planes. His eyes, witnesses would later recall, had a peculiar quality. They never quite seemed to focus on you so much as through you, as if calculating something just beneath your skin. Komarov had done well for himself, considering the circumstances. While others starved, he maintained his property. While others froze, his home had fuel. This success bred whispers, of course, but whispers were cheap in Moscow. Everyone had their suspicions about everyone else. Paranoia was the national pastime of the new Soviet state. On the morning of August 2nd, a young man named Dmitry Fedorov vanished. Dmitry had been looking for work, like so many others flooding into Moscow from the devastated countryside. Someone had told him that Komarov occasionally needed help with his horses, that he paid in food as well as rubles. Dmitry went to the house on Sadovaya Street just after dawn. He never came home. His sister reported him missing 3 days later, but the authorities barely glanced at her complaint. Missing persons? In Moscow, in 1921, there were thousands, tens of thousands. The revolution had turned the entire country into one vast graveyard, and people vanished into it daily. Some fled to other cities. Some died in alleyways. Some simply gave up and walked into the Moscow River with pockets full of stones. One more missing person meant nothing, but Dmitry Fedorov's sister was persistent. She returned to the police station again and again, until finally, more to silence her than from any genuine interest, a detective named Alexei Gromov agreed to make some inquiries. Gromov was 42 years old, a veteran of the old imperial police force who had managed to survive the revolution by keeping his head down and his politics flexible. He had seen things during those violent years that would have shattered lesser men. He thought himself beyond shock. He thought himself immune to horror. He was catastrophically wrong. Gromov began his investigation by visiting 26 Sadovaya Street. Komarov answered the door himself, his expression one of mild curiosity. Yes, a young man had come looking for work. No, Komarov hadn't hired him. The boy had left after an hour, perhaps less. Komarov couldn't say where he'd gone after that. The detective found nothing suspicious in the story. He found nothing suspicious in Komarov's manner. The man was calm, cooperative, even sympathetic to the sister's worry. Gromov thanked him for his time and left, but something nagged at him. Some instinct developed over decades of police work whispered that the interview had gone too smoothly. Komarov had been too composed, too helpful, too reasonable. Men with nothing to hide often became defensive when questioned. Komarov had shown no such reaction. He had simply stood there in his doorway, stone-faced and patient, waiting for Gromov to finish. 3 days later, another person went missing. This time, a woman, a widow named Ekaterina Sokolova who had been seeking domestic work. She too had last been seen heading toward Sadovaya Street. Gromov returned to Komarov's house, this time with two uniformed officers. Again, Komarov answered politely. Yes, the woman had come. No, he hadn't hired her. She had left disappointed. But this time, Gromov noticed something. A smell, faint but unmistakable, that seemed to be coming from behind the house. An odor of turned earth and something else. Something organic and wrong. He asked to search the property. Komarov hesitated for just a fraction of a second, his eyes narrowing almost imperceptibly. Then he shrugged and stepped aside. Of course, detective, I have nothing to hide. Those would prove to be some of the most grotesque words ever spoken. The garden behind Komarov's house sprawled across perhaps 200 square meters. It was August, and the weeds had grown thick and tall, creating a dense tangle of vegetation. Komarov claimed he grew vegetables there, though Gromov saw few signs of cultivation. What he did see in the far corner near the back fence was an area where the earth looked recently disturbed. He ordered the officers to start digging. They had gone down perhaps 3 feet when the first spade struck something that wasn't soil. One of the officers, a young man named Petrov who had joined the force only 6 months earlier, bent down and pulled away the loose dirt with his hands. His fingers touched fabric, then flesh. He jerked backward, retching. It was a body, a woman's body, based on the clothing. She had been dead perhaps a week, buried in a shallow grave without ceremony or care. Her face had already begun the early stages of decomposition, the features swelling and distorting. But what made Petrov vomit wasn't the decomposition. It was the wounds. Her throat had been cut so deeply that the head was nearly severed. The incision was clean, surgical, made with something extremely sharp. But that wasn't the worst of it. Her chest cavity had been opened, ribs pried apart, and the organs within were missing, removed with precision, taken. Gromov ordered them to keep digging. They found another body within an hour, then another, and another. By nightfall, they had unearthed 7 corpses in various stages of decomposition. By the following morning, the count had risen to 12. All showed the same pattern of violence. Throats cut with surgical precision, bodies mutilated, organs removed. Men and women both, some young, some old. All had been disposed of like refuse, like waste from some hideous manufacturing process. The garden of 26 Sadovaya Street had become a cemetery of atrocity. Komarov was arrested immediately, though he maintained his innocence with an eerie calm that disturbed everyone who encountered him. I know nothing of these bodies, he insisted. Someone must have been using my garden, perhaps while I slept. I am a heavy sleeper. But as the excavation continued over the following days, the number of victims continued to climb. 15, 20, 25. The shallow graves formed a grid pattern, methodically arranged, each precisely measured from its neighbors. This wasn't the work of some madman dumping bodies in panic. This was organized, planned. The garden had been deliberately converted into a burial ground, with the same efficiency one might apply to filing documents or organizing inventory. The victims began to be identified. Dmitry Fedorov was among them, buried in the southwest corner. Ekaterina Sokolova lay 3 graves to his right. Others were recognized by surviving family members who came to view the exhumed remains. A parade of the heartbroken, the furious, the destroyed. These were people who had been looking for work, for food, for any opportunity to survive in a country that had forgotten mercy. Instead, they had found Vasily Komarov. Forensic examination revealed details that would haunt investigators for years. The victims hadn't just been killed, they had been processed. The throat wounds were consistent with those used in slaughterhouses, designed to cause rapid exsanguination while keeping major muscle groups intact. The removal of organs had been performed with surgical knowledge, the cuts precise and purposeful. Several victims showed signs of blunt force trauma to the head, suggesting they had been rendered unconscious before the killing began. Komarov, it turned out, had learned his butchery skills during his earlier years working in slaughterhouses and as an assistant to a veterinary surgeon. He understood anatomy. He knew exactly where to cut, how deep to go, which organs could be removed cleanly and which required more delicate extraction. He had taken those skills, honed on animals, and applied them to human beings with methodical efficiency. The excavation continued for 3 weeks. When they finally stopped digging, the official count stood at 33 bodies. But Grimoff believed there were more. The garden was large, and they had only excavated areas where the earth showed obvious disturbance. How many more lay deeper, buried longer ago, their graves now hidden by vegetation and time? Neighbors, when questioned, admitted they had sometimes heard strange sounds from the property at night. Thuds, brief cries that stopped suddenly. But in Moscow in 1921, strange sounds were everywhere. People minded their own business. Survival demanded it. One neighbor, an elderly woman named Maria Antonova, confessed to something more disturbing. She had seen Komarov on multiple occasions digging in his garden late at night by lantern light. She had watched from her window as he dragged what looked like heavy sacks from his house to the garden, then spent hours digging, burying, covering. She had suspected nothing because, and this was the detail that made Grimoff's blood run cold, she had assumed he was simply hiding food supplies from potential thieves. That was what Moscow had become. A place where watching your neighbor bury bodies in the dark seemed less notable than watching him bury potatoes. As the investigation deepened, a clearer picture emerged of Komarov's methodology. He would identify desperate people, refugees, unemployed workers, homeless wanderers, and offer them work. Sometimes he promised jobs helping with horses. Sometimes he offered domestic positions. Sometimes he simply invited them in for a meal, for tea, for a moment of warmth in a cold world. Once inside his house, he would strike them from behind, usually with a heavy mallet or iron bar. The blow would render them unconscious or at least too stunned to fight effectively. Then, in a back room that investigators would later discover had been converted into a makeshift abattoir, he would cut their throats. He would drain the blood into buckets, old buckets that still stood in the corner, their interiors stained black. He would remove certain organs, though why remained unclear. And then, once the body had been thoroughly drained and butchered, he would wait until nightfall and carry it to the garden for burial. The process was industrial in its efficiency. Komarov had killed at least 33 people, and likely more, without ever arousing serious suspicion. He had murdered with the calm precision of a man performing routine labor. No frenzy, no passion, just work. The question that tormented everyone involved with the case was the simplest and most horrifying. Why? Vasily Komarov was born in 1871 in a small village outside Tula, south of Moscow. His childhood was unremarkable by the standards of late Imperial Russia, which is to say it was brutal. His father worked in an ironworks, his mother took in laundry. There were 7 children, of whom Vasily was the 4th. 3 of his siblings died before reaching age 5, victims of the diseases and malnutrition that claimed roughly half of all peasant children in that era. Young Vasily showed an early fascination with animals, particularly with their anatomy. He would spend hours examining the carcasses of chickens or rabbits, carefully pulling apart muscles, tracing bones, studying the architecture of life with an intensity that disturbed his parents. When he was 12, he found work at a local slaughterhouse, where his interest in anatomy evolved from curiosity to skill. He was good at the work, very good. He had steady hands and no squeamishness about blood. He could process a pig in minutes, reducing it from living creature to commercial cuts with swift, economical movements. His supervisors praised his efficiency. His co-workers found him strange, quiet, cold, more interested in the mechanics of killing than in conversation or camaraderie. At 19, Komarov left the village and moved to Moscow, where he found employment with a veterinary surgeon named Dr. Boris Petrov. For 3 years, he assisted in surgeries, learning the delicate work of opening bodies, repairing damage, suturing wounds. Dr. Petrov later recalled that Komarov had been an excellent assistant, precise, tireless, and utterly emotionless. He could have a horse's intestines in his hands, covered in blood to the elbows, and his expression wouldn't change, Petrov told investigators. "I always thought he simply had strong nerves. Now I wonder if he felt anything at all." After leaving DR, Petrov's employ, Komarov drifted through various occupations. He worked in slaughterhouses again. He did construction labor. He spent several years as a river porter. Eventually, he settled into horse trading, buying broken-down animals cheap, nursing them back to marginal health, then selling them for modest profit. It was honest work, if barely profitable. He married in 1895 a woman named Sofia Grigorievna. They had 2 children, both of whom survived to adulthood, remarkable in that era. By all outward appearances, Komarov was a devoted, if distant husband, a provider, if not a particularly warm father. Neighbors from that period remembered him as reserved, perhaps even cold, but not threatening. Just another hard man in a hard world. The revolution changed everything. When the Bolsheviks seized power in 1917, the civil war that followed turned Russia into a charnel house. Millions died from violence, disease, and starvation. The economy collapsed. Currency became worthless. Food was scarce. The rule of law evaporated as competing factions fought for control. Moscow itself descended into chaos. A city of over 1 million people suddenly cut off from supply lines, its population swelling with refugees while resources dwindled to nothing. In that chaos, something inside Vasily Komarov broke free. Or perhaps it had always been there, waiting for circumstances that would allow it to express itself without consequence. The first murder, the one investigators could definitively attribute to him, occurred in March 1920. The victim was a teenage boy named Yuri Molotov, age 16, who had come to Moscow from Kursk in search of work. According to Komarov's later confession, Yuri had responded to an advertisement Komarov had placed seeking help with horse trading. The boy arrived at Sadovaya Street eager and grateful. Komarov strangled him with a rope, then cut his throat. He buried the body in the garden that same night. Investigators would later try to extract from Komarov some explanation for this transformation from law-abiding citizen to serial killer. What had triggered it? What had been the catalyst? But Komarov proved frustratingly uncommunicative on the subject. When pressed, he would simply say that opportunities had presented themselves, and he had taken advantage of them. The city was full of people no one would miss, he explained during one interrogation. His voice is flat, as if he were discussing market prices for grain. Refugees, homeless, people without families or connections. They would knock on my door looking for work, for food. I realized no one would come looking if they disappeared. This answer chilled investigators because of its rationality. Komarov hadn't killed in a frenzy of madness. He had killed because he had performed a cost-benefit analysis and concluded that the benefits outweighed the risks. The question of what those benefits were would torment the investigation. Money was clearly part of it. Each victim would have carried whatever small valuables they possessed. A few rubles, perhaps a watch, maybe some jewelry or a decent coat. Komarov admitted to taking these items and selling them. But the amounts would have been trivial. Certainly not enough to justify the extraordinary risk of serial murder. Food was another possibility. Some investigators theorized that Komarov had been selling human flesh on the black market, passing it off as pork or beef in a city where starvation made people willing to eat anything. This would explain the surgical precision with which he butchered his victims, the removal of organs, the draining of blood. The theory was never proven, though several black market meat dealers were questioned about suspicious sources. None would admit to buying from Komarov, but in the criminal underworld of post-revolutionary Moscow, such admissions were unlikely regardless of truth. But as investigators dug deeper into Komarov's psychology, interviewing him repeatedly, studying his behavior, analyzing his patterns, a more disturbing explanation emerged. Vasily Komarov killed because he enjoyed it. This conclusion was based not on any dramatic confession but on accumulated details. The care he took in selecting victims, always vulnerable, always isolated, always desperate. The ritualistic nature of the murders, always the same room, always the same method, always followed by the same careful disposal. The fact that he had continued killing even after accumulating significant wealth from his victims' possessions suggesting that material gain wasn't the primary motivation. And then there was the way he spoke about the murders when investigators finally broke through his wall of silence. His voice never changed inflection. His face never showed emotion. But there was a quality to his descriptions, an attention to detail, a lingering over certain moments, that suggested he was reliving the experiences with something approaching pleasure. "I would watch them realize what was happening," he told Detective Grimoff during one interrogation. "That moment when the confusion left their eyes and fear took its place. When they understood that they had made a terrible mistake trusting me. That was interesting. Interesting. Not exciting. Not satisfying. Interesting." As if he were describing a curiosity observed in nature, rather than the moment of absolute terror before he ended a human life. Psychiatric evaluation was primitive in Soviet Russia in the early 1920s, but several doctors attempted to assess Komarov's mental state. The consensus was that he displayed characteristics of what would later be termed psychopathy: a complete absence of empathy, an inability to form genuine emotional connections, a tendency to view other people as objects rather than beings. One psychiatrist noted that Komarov seemed to lack the capacity for remorse not because he was repressing it, but because the neurological structures that produce such emotions appeared to be simply absent. Yet he wasn't insane by the legal standards of the time. He understood right from wrong. He knew his actions were illegal. He had taken extensive precautions to avoid detection. This was the paradox of Komarov. He was simultaneously a monster beyond normal human comprehension and a ruthlessly practical planner who had nearly succeeded in hiding his crimes indefinitely. As the investigation continued, more details of his methodology emerged. Komarov had kept meticulous records, not of the murders themselves, but of the items he had taken from victims. In a ledger hidden beneath floorboards in his bedroom, investigators found lists of pawned items, dates, amounts received. Cross-referencing these with missing persons reports painted a devastating picture. Komarov had been killing regularly, sometimes 2 or 3 victims a month, for over a year. The pace had actually accelerated as he grew more confident in his methods. The 33 bodies found in his garden represented only a fraction of his activities from March 1920 to August 1921. Before that, he might have been disposing of bodies elsewhere. After the garden became too crowded, he might have started using other locations. The true death toll would never be known with certainty, but some investigators believed it could easily exceed 50. Most of the identified victims shared similar profiles. They were newcomers to Moscow, they had no stable housing, they had few social connections, and they were desperate enough to trust a stranger offering work. These were people society had already half forgotten even before Komarov killed them. Their disappearances hadn't triggered investigations because in the chaos of post-revolutionary Russia, people disappeared constantly. Komarov had understood this instinctively. He had recognized that the social collapse around him had created perfect hunting conditions. The revolution hadn't just destroyed the old order, it had dissolved the social bonds that protected individuals. In the old Russia, villages were tight-knit. Everyone knew everyone. A disappearance would be noticed immediately. But in the new Russia, especially in overwhelmed cities like Moscow, anonymity was the norm. You could kill someone and no one would know they were gone. The wolf had found his sheep. The house at 26 Sadovaya Street was a structure of modest dimensions, 2 floors, 7 rooms, built in the traditional Russian style with timber walls and a pitched roof. From the street, it looked utterly unremarkable. Inside, investigators discovered a carefully maintained nightmare. The ground floor contained a kitchen, a sitting room, and what appeared to be a storage area for Komarov's legitimate horse trading business. Upstairs were 3 bedrooms and a small study. Komarov's wife and adult children had lived in 2 of the bedrooms. The third, investigators initially believed, was a spare room. They were wrong. The spare bedroom had been converted into what forensic examiners would later describe as a killing room. The transformation was subtle enough that family members claimed they had never noticed anything amiss. The door was usually kept locked, and Komarov had explained he used it for paperwork related to his business. But once investigators examined it closely, the room's true purpose became horrifyingly apparent. The floorboards showed extensive staining, despite obvious attempts at cleaning. Luminol testing, primitive in that era but available, revealed massive amounts of blood residue concentrated in the center of the room. The walls had been covered with tin sheeting, ostensibly for insulation, but the sheeting showed pitting and discoloration consistent with blood spatter. A heavy wooden table stood against one wall, its surface scarred with deep cut marks and stained black in places. This was Komarov's workshop. This was where he transformed living people into corpses. Investigators reconstructed his process through a combination of forensic evidence, Komarov's own admissions, and the condition of the bodies recovered from the garden. The picture that emerged was one of industrial efficiency applied to murder. First came the lure. Komarov would identify potential victims through various means: advertisements for work, conversations in breadlines, approaches to people he saw begging in the street. He had a talent for recognizing vulnerability, for spotting those who were so desperate they would ignore warning signs that might have deterred others. His offers were always specific enough to seem legitimate but vague enough to require a visit to his home for details. Once a victim arrived at 26 Sadovaya Street, Komarov would usher them inside under some pretext, to show them where horses were stabled, to discuss the work over tea, to examine qualifications in his office. He was unfailingly polite, even solicitous. Several survivors, people who had visited Komarov for work but left unharmed for various reasons, described him as somewhat cold but perfectly proper in his behavior. The key moment came when he could isolate the victim. Often this meant leading them upstairs under some excuse, to retrieve paperwork, to show them a storage area, to discuss private matters away from other household members. Once they entered the killing room, Komarov would close the door behind them. Then he would strike. His preferred weapon was a heavy mallet, approximately 2 kilograms, with a flat striking surface. He would swing it from behind, targeting the base of the skull. The blow was usually sufficient to render victims unconscious, though not always immediately fatal. Forensic evidence suggested that some victims remained partially conscious during what followed, though severe cranial trauma would have left them disoriented and unable to mount effective resistance. Once the victim was incapacitated, Komarov would drag them to the center of the room, positioning them face up on the stained floorboards. Here his slaughterhouse training became evident. He would make a deep incision across the throat, severing both carotid arteries and the jugular veins. The cut was performed with a long, extremely sharp knife. Investigators found several in the house, all meticulously maintained and honed to razor edges. The throat wound caused rapid exsanguination. Blood would pour from the severed vessels, pooling on the tin-covered floor. Komarov had arranged the room with a slight decline toward one corner, where a bucket could be positioned to collect the blood. This wasn't squeamishness or an attempt to minimize mess. It was practical. Blood was valuable. It could be disposed of gradually in the city's sewers rather than all at once. Could potentially be sold, though to whom remained unclear. The bleeding would continue for several minutes until the heart stopped beating. During this time, Komarov would wait, watching. When questioned about these moments, he described them with disturbing detachment. The body empties itself, takes time. I would sit and wait for it to finish. After death came the butchery. Using the same knife he'd employed for the throat cutting, Komarov would make a Y incision across the chest and abdomen. The same pattern used in medical autopsies and veterinary examinations. He would then use a combination of cutting and prying to open the ribcage, exposing the thoracic cavity. With practiced efficiency, he would remove the heart, lungs, liver, kidneys, and sometimes other organs. The purpose of this organ removal remained one of the investigation's most troubling mysteries. Komarov claimed he disposed of them separately, burning them in his stove to reduce bulk. But investigators found this explanation suspicious. The organs would have been the most valuable parts of a human carcass if, and this was the theory that horrified everyone involved, if he was indeed selling human flesh for food. Testing of samples from his property revealed traces of human remains in his stove, in his garden soil, and in drains throughout the house. But whether he had been consuming the flesh himself, feeding it to animals, selling it, or simply disposing of it remained frustratingly unclear. Komarov alternated between different explanations, seemingly amused by the investigators' discomfort with the question. After the organs were removed, Komarov would dismember the body at the major joints: shoulders, elbows, hips, knees. This reduced the corpse to manageable pieces that could be more easily buried. He would wrap these pieces in canvas or burlap, creating bundles that could be carried to the garden one at a time without arousing suspicion if anyone happened to observe him from a window. The burial itself always occurred at night. Komarov would dig a grave approximately 4 feet deep, shallow by conventional standards, but sufficient to prevent immediate discovery in a city where no one was looking. He would place the wrapped body parts in the hole, then refill it, tamping down the earth carefully. Sometimes he would plant seedlings over the fresh graves, creating the impression of legitimate gardening. The entire process, from initial blow to final burial, would take between 4 and 6 hours, typically spanning an afternoon and evening. During this time, Komarov's family remained elsewhere in the house, unaware, or so they claimed, of what was transpiring in the locked room upstairs. This claim of family ignorance became one of the most controversial aspects of the case. Komarov's wife, Sophia, insisted she had never suspected her husband of murder. She admitted he had become increasingly secretive over the past year, that he sometimes worked late in his office and forbade anyone from disturbing him, that strange sounds occasionally emanated from the locked room. But she attributed all of this to his business dealings. He was a horse trader. Of course, there would be odd hours and private matters. Investigators were skeptical. How could a woman live in a house where 33 people had been murdered without noticing anything? The smells alone should have been overwhelming: blood, death, decomposition. Yet Sophia maintained her innocence, and no evidence could be found directly linking her to the crimes. She was eventually released, though under such a cloud of suspicion that she left Moscow shortly after and was never heard from again. The children, both in their 20s, were similarly questioned and released. Neither showed any knowledge of their father's activities, and both appeared genuinely devastated by the revelations. They too disappeared from public record after the trial, presumably changing their names and fleeing to distant parts of the country to escape the stigma. But the most haunting aspect of the killing room wasn't its physical evidence. It was the realization that Komarov had been operating this personal slaughterhouse for over a year in the middle of a densely populated city, and no one had noticed. The house had neighbors on both sides and across the street. People walked past it daily. Children played in the surrounding streets. And yet the murders continued, undetected, uninterrupted, until chance and one persistent detective finally exposed them. Investigators interviewed dozens of neighbors. A few admitted to noticing unusual activity: lights burning late at night, the sound of digging, an occasional foul odor they attributed to spoiled food or dead rats. But no one had investigated. No one had reported concerns to authorities. Moscow in 1921 was a city where minding your own business wasn't just polite. It was survival. What was I supposed to do? One neighbor asked during questioning. Go knock on his door and ask if he was murdering people? In those days, asking too many questions about anything could get you arrested yourself. You kept your head down. You survived. This was the environment that had enabled Komarov. Not just the physical chaos of post-revolutionary Russia, but the psychological collapse of community. The revolution had shattered social trust so completely that people no longer looked out for one another. Suspicion and fear had replaced solidarity. In such conditions, a predator could operate with near impunity. And Komarov had been a very efficient predator indeed. The trial of Vasily Komarov began on November 14, 1921, in Moscow's Revolutionary Tribunal. It lasted 5 days. Remarkably brief given the magnitude of the crimes, but Soviet justice in that era prioritized efficiency over deliberation. The verdict was never in doubt. The only real question was whether Komarov would provide any insight into his motivation before the inevitable execution. The courtroom was packed daily with spectators, journalists, and the families of identified victims. The atmosphere combined circus-like sensationalism with genuine horror. Komarov sat in the defendant's dock expressionless, occasionally consulting with his state-appointed attorney, but showing no visible emotion as prosecutors detailed his crimes in graphic specificity. The evidence was overwhelming. 33 bodies recovered from his property. Forensic evidence linking him to each murder. A ledger documenting the sale of victims' possessions. Tools and implements matched to wounds. And, most damningly, Komarov's own partial confession. He admitted to the killings while quibbling over certain details and motivations. Prosecutor Ivan Krylenko, one of the revolution's most zealous legal minds, delivered a closing argument that framed Komarov not just as a criminal but as a symptom of societal collapse. This man, Krylenko thundered, gesturing at the defendant, represents the ultimate degeneration of human nature when society's bonds are dissolved. He looked at his fellow human beings and saw only meat. Only resources to be exploited, only obstacles to be removed. He is what happens when the social contract is completely abandoned. The irony of this argument, delivered by a representative of a regime that had itself caused massive death through war, terror, and famine, was lost on no one. But it played well to the crowd. Komarov's defense attorney made a half-hearted attempt to argue diminished capacity based on the psychological evaluations, but even he seemed convinced of his client's guilt. The trial was more spectacle than serious judicial proceeding, an opportunity for the Soviet state to demonstrate it was still capable of enforcing law even amid chaos. On November 19, 1921, the tribunal found Vasily Komarov guilty on 33 counts of murder. The sentence was death by firing squad, to be carried out within a week. Komarov received the verdict without visible reaction. He was led from the courtroom still wearing the same flat, affectless expression he had maintained throughout the proceedings. When a journalist shouted a question asking if he had any remorse, Komarov stopped, turned and said, "Remorse for what? They were nobodies. No one missed them until they were found." Then he was gone, hustled away by guards before the crowd's outraged screaming could turn into something more violent. During his final week of life, Komarov was interviewed multiple times by investigators hoping to extract more information about potential unrecovered victims. He proved alternately cooperative and evasive, seeming to enjoy the attention while providing few concrete details. He confirmed that the 33 bodies represented only those killed during his most productive period, a phrase that made interrogators physically ill. Before that, he admitted, there had been others, but he couldn't or wouldn't say how many or where they might be buried. "Moscow is full of graves," he told Detective Gromov during their final conversation. "The revolution killed hundreds of thousands. What difference do a few dozen more make?" Gromov, who had spent 3 months immersed in the investigation and had lost significant weight from stress and lack of appetite, couldn't formulate an immediate response. Finally, he said, "The difference is that you chose to add to the suffering. You didn't have to. You wanted to." Komarov smiled for the first and only time that Gromov had ever witnessed. It was not a pleasant expression. "Yes," he said simply, "I wanted to." On November 25, 1921, at dawn, Vasily Komarov was taken to a courtyard behind Butyrka prison. A 6-man firing squad waited. According to the official report, Komarov walked to the execution post without assistance, refused a blindfold, and remained standing upright until the order was given to fire. The volley struck him in the chest. He collapsed immediately and was pronounced dead within seconds. His body was buried in an unmarked grave in a prison cemetery. No family members claimed the remains. Within months, the exact location of his burial was lost to bureaucratic confusion, and Komarov's final resting place remains unknown. But while Komarov's life ended that November morning, the case's reverberations continued for years. The house at 26 Sadovaya Street became a macabre tourist attraction, with people traveling from across Moscow to stand outside and stare at the Garden of Horrors. Eventually, Soviet authorities demolished the structure in 1923, unable to find anyone willing to live there and unwilling to let it stand as a monument to atrocity. The investigation into potential additional victims continued sporadically through 1922. Several other missing persons from the 1920 to 1921 period were tentatively attributed to Komarov based on circumstantial evidence, bringing the unofficial total to 41 possible victims. But without bodies or direct evidence, these remain speculation. More disturbingly, the case raised questions about how many other predators might be operating undetected in the chaos of post-revolutionary Russia. Komarov had succeeded for over a year because the social infrastructure necessary to catch serial killers, missing persons tracking, coordinated investigation, community vigilance, had completely collapsed. If one man could murder 33 people in the middle of Moscow without being caught until chance exposed him, how many others might be doing the same elsewhere? These questions were never satisfactorily answered, partly because Soviet authorities were reluctant to admit the extent of lawlessness in their new society, and partly because the resources for such investigations simply didn't exist. The Komarov case consumed enormous investigative effort, and there was no capacity to look for similar patterns elsewhere. Some criminologists later argued that Komarov represented a new type of killer, one who emerged specifically from conditions of social collapse. Unlike traditional serial killers who were driven by psychological compulsion, Komarov seemed motivated by opportunity and practical benefit. He killed because circumstances made it easy and profitable, not because of some inner drive he couldn't control. This made him, in some ways, more frightening than conventional murderers. His crimes suggested that under the right conditions, ordinary sociopathy could escalate into systematic killing without the killer ever crossing into obvious insanity. The families of identified victims received little closure. Most were too poor to afford elaborate burials, and the bodies, recovered after weeks or months of burial, often in advanced decomposition, required mass interment in a common grave. A small memorial was erected in 1922, bearing the names of those who had been identified. It stood for less than a year before being removed during a wave of urban modernization that swept away anything deemed morbid or counter-revolutionary. Detective Alexei Gromov, who had broken the case, received no particular recognition for his work. In fact, his career suffered. Soviet authorities were embarrassed that such extensive crimes had occurred undetected under their watch, and Gromov became an uncomfortable reminder of their failure. He was quietly transferred to a provincial posting in 1923 and died of a heart attack in 1927, aged 48. His obituary made no mention of the Komarov investigation. But perhaps the most haunting legacy of Vasily Komarov was the reminder that monsters don't always announce themselves as such. Komarov didn't lurk in shadows or display obvious signs of madness. He looked like everyone else. He lived a normal life, had a family, conducted legitimate business. The horror was precisely that he appeared so unremarkable, so ordinary, so easily overlooked. His neighbors had dismissed strange sounds and odd behaviors because they couldn't conceive that something so awful was happening so close. The authorities had ignored missing persons reports because the broader context of social collapse made individual disappearances seem insignificant. And Komarov had continued killing because no one was looking, no one was counting, no one was paying attention. The case asked a question that still resonates. In a society where death has become commonplace, where suffering is universal, where everyone is focused purely on survival, who notices one more grave, who mourns one more corpse, who remembers one more forgotten victim, Vasily Komarov understood that, in such circumstances, some people become invisible even while alive. And once they disappeared into his house, into his killing room, into his garden of bones, it was as if they had never existed at all. The wolf had fed on the forgotten, and no one had heard them scream. When investigators finally closed the case file in late 1922, the official death toll stood at 33 confirmed victims. But a notation in the margin, written in Detective Gromov's hand, suggested a darker truth. Many more. He told me there were many more. We'll never know how many. Moscow's post-revolutionary chaos had created the perfect environment for a predator, and Vasily Komarov had exploited it with the cold efficiency of a machine. He had transformed his home into an abattoir, his garden into a graveyard, and himself into something beyond human understanding. And in the end, he died as he had lived, showing no remorse, feeling no guilt, seeing his victims as nothing more than opportunities taken, problems solved, resources exploited. The house at 26 Sadovaya Street is gone now, the garden paved over, the graves scattered. But somewhere beneath Moscow's modern streets, fragments of those 33 souls, and perhaps many more, still rest in unmarked earth. They were the forgotten victims of a forgotten monster, casualties of a time when death was so common that murder barely registered. Vasily Komarov vanished into history as quickly as his victims vanished into his garden. But the questions his crimes raised remain. How many monsters walk among us undetected? How much suffering occurs unnoticed? And when society collapses, when the bonds of community dissolve, when survival becomes the only imperative, what prevents us all from becoming wolves? The answer, if Komarov's story suggests anything, is nothing at all. Just opportunity, just choice, just the thin veneer of civilization that, once stripped away, reveals what some people were waiting to become all along. The Garden of Bones is gone, but its lessons remain, buried just beneath the surface, waiting for anyone willing to dig deep enough to find them. Thank you for watching and being part of this dive into the dark and fascinating stories that keep us all on edge. If you enjoyed the ride, remember to like, subscribe, and share with others who crave a good mystery. Tell us where you're watching from. I love knowing where in the world our true crime family is tuning in. Your presence means a lot. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and keep digging into the shadows where truth and mystery meet.